The noonday sun glinted off fresh powder as Silas Harlow tracked the buck through the silent pines. His breath hung in the frigid Montana air, each exhale a reminder that he was still alive, though there were days he questioned why. The deer paused in a clearing ahead, its massive rack catching sunlight like a crown of gold. Silas raised his Sharps rifle with practiced ease, settling the bead on the buck's shoulder. His finger curled around the trigger muscle memory from years as a Union Army scout. The animal was perfect enough meat to last him weeks in this Blacktail Mountain winter of 1872. He drew a slow breath, ready to squeeze. Then he saw her. A small figure emerged from behind a snow-laden pine just beyond the buck. A child no more than 9 or 10 with copper skin and hair black as a raven's wing. Her dark eyes met his across the clearing, holding a wisdom no child should possess. The deer, sensing nothing, continued to graze. The girl didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with those ancient eyes. Silas lowered his rifle slowly. Something in that shared gaze felt sacred, like a message delivered without words. The buck, sensing the shift in energy, lifted its head, nostrils flaring. A moment later, it bounded away, snow kicking up in its wake. The girl remained staring at Silas with unwavering intensity. He raised his hand in greeting, but before he could speak, she melted back into the forest like a spirit returning to the other world. Silas stood frozen, wondering if the isolation had finally begun to unravel his mind. 5 years alone on this ridge had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He shook his head and slung the rifle over his shoulder. No deer meant another night of salted pork and beans. "Looks like we're going hungry tonight, Elizabeth," he muttered to the empty air. No answer came. There never was one, but he kept talking to her anyway. The cabin stood sturdy against the wind that howled down from the mountain peaks. Silas had built it with his own hands 3 years ago, after wandering west with no destination beyond away from the memories, away from the war, away from the epidemic that had stolen Elizabeth and their unborn child. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth, watching sparks rise like fleeting souls. The single room was sparse but functional, bed in one corner, a table and chair shelves lined with medical supplies and books. His training as an Army medic had given him skills that occasionally drew people from the scattered homesteads miles below seeking help for ailments or injuries. He rarely turned them away, but neither did he invite conversation beyond what was necessary. Their gratitude made him uncomfortable. He wasn't here to be thanked. On the small bedside table sat a daguerreotype, in a simple frame, Elizabeth on their wedding day, her smile gentle, her eyes bright with promise. Beside it lay his battered copy of Gray's Anatomy pages, worn from constant reference. "Should have shot that buck," he said to the photograph, "getting soft in my old age." In his mind, he could hear her laughing response, "38 is hardly old age, Silas Harlow. And there'll be other deer." He smiled despite himself. Even in death, Elizabeth remained his conscience, his better nature. Outside, the light faded as snow began to fall again. Silas sat on the porch with a tin cup of whiskey, watching darkness claim the land. The new moon hung like a silver sickle in the vast expanse of stars. "Do you exist out there somewhere?" he asked the night sky. "Or is it just emptiness pretending to have meaning?" The wind answered with a hollow moan through the pines. Silas drained his cup and went inside. Talking to ghosts was a poor substitute for sleep. 3 days passed with no sign of the girl. Silas convinced himself she had been a figment of his imagination, a manifestation of loneliness playing tricks on his mind. He returned to his routine, chopping wood, tending his small stable of 2 horses, organizing his medical supplies. On the 4th night, a blizzard descended from the north, fierce enough to make the cabin creak and groan like a ship at sea. Silas added logs to the fire and settled in with one of his medical journals, reading by lamplight, as wind hurled snow against the windows. A sound cut through the storm's howl, not the wind, but something else, something alive. Silas set down his book and listened. There it came again, a faint scraping against the outer wall of the stable. He reached for his rifle, then paused. Bears would be hibernating this time of year. Wolves rarely came this close to human dwellings unless desperate with hunger. He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, snow driving sideways into his face. He squinted against the onslaught, making his way toward the stable through knee-deep drifts. The horses were restless inside, shifting nervously in their stalls. Silas raised the lantern, its glow catching on something huddled against the outer wall. The girl from the forest lay curled in the snow, her small body shivering violently. Her feet were bare lips, blue with cold eyes closed. Beside her, a trail of blood stained the white ground pink. "Good God," Silas breathed. Setting down the lantern, he knelt and pressed his fingers to her neck, finding a pulse rapid but present. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sticks wrapped in a threadbare dress too thin for winter. Inside the cabin, he laid her gently before the fire, removing her frozen dress with clinical efficiency. He wrapped her in his warmest blanket, then examined her feet, which were lacerated with deep cuts. Embedded in several wounds were slivers of glass, as though she had run through broken windows. Working methodically, Silas cleaned the wounds with alcohol, removed the glass fragments with tweezers, and stitched the deeper cuts. The girl didn't wake, but occasionally whimpered in her unconscious state. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "You're going to be all right." He prepared a solution of willow bark for when she woke, knowing the pain would be substantial. As he worked, he checked her for other injuries, finding several older bruises in various stages of healing across her back and arms. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch. On the inside of her arm, just below the elbow, was a series of small, precise puncture marks. Not random injuries, but the kind made by repeated injections with a hypodermic needle. Further examination revealed small surgical scars along her hairline and behind her ears, the kind only a trained physician would make. Someone had been using this child for medical experimentation. Silas's jaw tightened as anger rose in his chest. During the war, he had seen doctors perform procedures on injured soldiers that had more to do with curiosity than healing. He'd heard whispers of experiments conducted on prisoners and slaves. But a native child alone in the wilderness. "What happened to you?" he whispered. The girl's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her breathing had steadied to her body, gradually warming. Silas placed another log on the fire and settled into his chair to keep watch through the night. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace held. Silas found himself watching the child's face, searching for some clue to her identity. "What do you think, Elizabeth?" he asked softly. "Another stray soul for us to patch up." He could almost hear her reply. "Every soul deserves mending, Silas, even yours." Dawn broke with painful brightness, sunlight reflecting off new snow like shattered glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of smooth white dunes and buried landmarks. Silas, who had dozed fitfully in his chair, that woke to find the girl watching him with wide, dark eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move except to follow him with her gaze as he stood and stretched his stiff limbs. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Can you understand me?" No response, just that unblinking stare. Silas approached slowly and knelt beside her. "My name is Silas. Silas Harlow. I found you in the snow last night. You were hurt." The girl's eyes flicked to her bandaged feet, then back to his face. Still no words. "Are you hungry?" A slight nod. "Progress." Silas prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses. When he turned back, the girl had managed to sit up, the blanket clutched tightly around her small frame. He offered the bowl, which she took with trembling hands. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing desperation, as though afraid the food might be taken away. "Easy now," Silas cautioned. "Too fast and you'll make yourself sick." The girl slowed marginally but didn't stop until the bowl was empty. She looked up at him expectantly. "More?" he asked. Another nod. He refilled her bowl, watching as she ate the second portion with slightly more restraint. While she ate, Silas moved to a shelf of medical supplies, selecting a bottle of chloroform he kept for emergency surgeries. The reaction was immediate and violent. The girl threw the bowl aside and scrambled backward until she hit the wall, eyes wide with terror. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, body convulsing as though in the grip of a seizure. Silas quickly returned the bottle to the shelf and raised his hands, palms out. "I'm sorry," he said. "I won't touch that. See, it's gone." Gradually, the girl's trembling subsided, though her eyes remained fixed on the shelf, as if the bottle might somehow attack her of its own accord. "You've seen that before," Silas said quietly. "Someone used it on you." She drew her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Silas sat on the floor, maintaining his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm a healer, a medicine man. I was a medic during the war." The girl's gaze shifted to the daguerreotype of Elizabeth on the bedside table. That's my wife, Silas explained following her gaze. Elizabeth, she's not here anymore. Something flickered in the girl's expression, not quite understanding, but recognition of some kind. She pointed to the photograph, then to the empty space beside Silas. A chill ran down his spine. What do you mean? The girl made a flowing gesture with her hands like water running or a curtain moving in the wind. I don't understand, Silas admitted. She sighed softly, the first sound he had heard her make, and returned to staring at him with those unnervingly ancient eyes. Silas decided not to press further. You need rest. Your feet will take time to heal. You can stay here until you're better or until we figure out where you belong. He stood and moved to the door. I need to check on the horses. I'll be right outside if you need anything. In the stable, Silas leaned against a wooden post and took a deep breath. The girl's reaction to the chloroform bottle had shaken him. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had hurt her, they had medical training, and they might be looking for her. What have I gotten myself into, Elizabeth? He murmured. Outside, the mountain stood silent and indifferent under its blanket of snow. But for the first time in years, Silas felt the stirring of something long dormant within him, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. For 2 days, the girl remained silent. She accepted food and water, allowed Silas to change her bandages, but offered no words, no name. She slept most of the time, her small body exhausted from whatever ordeal had brought her to his doorstep. On the 3rd morning, Silas decided her feet had healed enough for a proper bath. He heated water on the stove, filled his copper tub halfway, and added a few drops of Elizabeth's lavender soap, one of the few possessions of hers he'd kept. It's not too hot, he assured the girl who watched the proceedings with wary interest. But you need to get clean. Infection is the enemy of healing. He turned his back to give her privacy, listening to the soft splash as she lowered herself into the water. When he glanced over his shoulder, she was sitting in the tub, knees drawn to her chest hair, hanging in wet ropes around her face. I'll wash your dress, he said, picking up the tattered garment from the floor. In the meantime, you can wear one of my shirts. It'll be like a dress on you anyway. As he worked, Silas found himself talking to her the way he often talked to Elizabeth, a running commentary with no expectation of response. Been a while since I had company up here, he said, hanging her dress to dry near the fire. Most folks find their way to me only when they need stitching up or a tooth pulled. Not much for social calls, which suits me fine. He glanced at the girl who was watching him over the rim of the tub. You're welcome to stay until spring if need be. Can't imagine you'd want to, though. Lonely place for a child. The ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone so quickly he might have imagined it. When she finished bathing, Silas handed her one of his cotton shirts and a length of rope to use as a belt. As expected, the shirt hung to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips until she rolled them up. There, he said, not exactly the height of fashion, but it'll do until your dress dries. That afternoon, while the girl dozed by the fire, Silas examined her dress more carefully. It was a simple garment of buckskin adorned with a few beads and porcupine quills in a pattern he recognized as Crow Not Apache, as he'd initially assumed. The Crow Reservation was nearly 100 miles northwest, a long journey for a child on foot, especially in winter. Who are you? He wondered aloud, glancing at the sleeping girl. And what are you running from? The answer came sooner than he expected. Silas was splitting wood outside the cabin when he heard a rustle in the underbrush, too deliberate to be an animal. He set down his and reached for the rifle he kept propped against the porch rail, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. Show yourself, he called. I've no quarrel with anyone, but I'll defend what's mine. Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then a figure emerged from the shadows of the pines, a woman tall and straight-backed, despite obvious exhaustion. She wore traditional Crow clothing under a threadbare wool coat, her black hair braided with feathers and beads. Most striking was the scar that ran from her left temple to the corner of her mouth, a pale line against her copper skin. She carried a bow with an arrow nocked but not drawn, her stance neither threatening nor submissive. I come for the sacred child, she said in perfect unaccented English, the one who sees beyond. Silas kept his rifle lowered but ready. There's a girl here, yes. Found her half-frozen 3 nights ago. She yours? The woman's dark eyes assessed him carefully. Not mine by blood, mine by duty. She took a step forward, then stopped as Silas tensed. I mean no harm to you, healer. I see your medicines through the window. I know you're kind. And what kind is that? One who mends rather than breaks. She lowered her bow slightly. The child, is she well? She's alive. Feet were cut away pretty bad, but they're healing. She hasn't spoken a word since I found her. Something like relief crossed the woman's face. She speaks when she chooses, not before. Who are you? Silas asked. I am called Dakota. It means friend to all in the white man's tongue. A hint of irony colored her voice. Though not all have proven worthy of friendship. Silas Harlow. He hesitated, then made a decision. The girl's inside. She's been through something terrible. There are marks on her, needle marks, surgical scars. Someone's been experimenting on her. Dakota's expression hardened. Yes, this I know. Care to explain? It is better shown than told. She gestured toward the cabin. May I see her? Silas considered her for a long moment, then nodded. Your weapons stay outside. Dakota placed her bow and quiver against a tree without argument and followed Silas to the cabin. Inside, the girl was awake, sitting cross-legged before the fire in Silas's oversized shirt. She looked up as they entered, her face transforming at the sight of Dakota. Nolly, Dakota breathed, dropping to her knees. The girl Nolly scrambled to her feet and threw herself into Dakota's arms with a soft cry. It was the first sound Silas had heard her make, and it pierced him unexpectedly. They held each other tightly, Dakota murmuring words in the Crow language, too soft for Silas to catch. When they finally separated, Dakota examined Nolly's bandaged feet and the healing cuts with a healer's practiced eye. You have cared for her well, she said to Silas. A skilled hand. Army medic, he replied simply. Seen worse. Dakota nodded, her gaze traveling around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the medical supplies, the daguerreotype of Elizabeth. You live alone, far from others. By choice, as do I. She turned to face him fully. Nolly is special, sacred to our people. She is a spirit seer, one who walks between worlds. Silas frowned. I don't follow. She sees those who have passed beyond, speaks with them. Dakota's gaze was steady, challenging him to dismiss her words. In our tribe, such children are protected, guided by those who understand their gift. When the soldiers came to our village last summer, Nolly's parents were killed. I was chosen to be her guardian. Silas struggled to keep his expression neutral. He'd heard of such beliefs among native tribes, but had always attributed them to superstition, the natural human desire to make sense of death. You don't believe, Dakota observed. I believe in what I can see and touch, Silas replied. The rest is uncertain. Many things are uncertain, healer. It does not make them untrue. Dakota turned back to Nolly, speaking to her in Crow. The girl nodded, her gaze moving between Dakota and Silas. She says you have been kind, Dakota translated. She says your wife watches over you still. A chill crawled up Silas's spine. I never told her about my wife. She did not need to be told. Dakota's expression softened slightly. The dead speak to her. Sometimes they speak of the living they left behind. Silas shook his head. That's impossible. Is it? Dakota challenged. In your medicine books, are there not things once thought impossible that you now know to be true? The invisible seeds of sickness that float on air. The beating heart that can be stopped and started by your hands. She had him there. Medical science was constantly evolving, constantly challenging what was known to be true. Who was experimenting on her? He asked, changing the subject. Dakota's face darkened. A white doctor who believes he can capture the soul with his machines and medicines. He took several children from neighboring tribes, those rumored to have the sight or healing powers. Most died. Nolly escaped. And you've been running ever since. Yes, he sends men to hunt us. They are not far behind. Silas felt a knot form in his stomach. You've led them here. Perhaps, or perhaps the snow has covered our trail. Dakota straightened. We will leave at first light. You have done enough. Her feet aren't fully healed, Silas protested, and there's another storm coming. I can feel it in my bones. Dakota studied him. Why would you risk yourself for strangers? For Indians. I don't see Indians, Silas replied. I see a wounded child and a woman at the end of her strength. Stay until the weather breaks at least. Then decide. A long moment passed between them, filled with the quiet crackling of the fire and the distant moan of wind through the pines. Finally, Dakota nodded. Until the weather breaks. The predicted storm arrived the following day, bringing howling winds and snow that fell in sheets. Silas, Dakota, and Nolly remained confined to the cabin, a reluctant trio bound by circumstance rather than choice. Dakota kept Nolly close, speaking to her in low tones, often in their native language. The girls seemed transformed by Dakota's presence, still silent with Silas, but animated when communicating with her guardian through gestures and expressions. "How long were you with the army?" Dakota asked that evening as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew. Silas glanced up, surprised by the direct question. 6 years. Enlisted in 61, served until after Appomattox. As a healer, started as a scout, had some medical training from my father who was a country doctor. When they discovered I could stitch a wound without fainting, they made me a medic. Dakota nodded. I worked with army doctors for 2 years, as a translator and assistant. It was Silas's turn to be surprised. That explains your English. I learned from missionaries as a child, then from the doctors. They taught me their medicine in exchange for knowledge of our healing plants. A shadow crossed her face. Not all of them used this knowledge wisely. This doctor, who's after Nolly, he was Army. Yes, Dr. Vernon Blackwood. He served at Fort Ellis near Bozeman. Dakota's fingers traced the scar on her face absently. He was respected, trusted. No one questioned when he requested native assistance or showed interest in our ways. And the experiments began after the war. Slowly at first, observations of our healing ceremonies, questions about our beliefs regarding death and the afterlife. Then he began seeking out those with special gifts. She looked at Nolly, who was drawing patterns in the condensation on the window. Children mostly. Their spirits are more open. Silas frowned. What exactly was he trying to do? He believes there is a door between the world of the living and the dead, that it can be opened with the right key. Dakota's voice was flat, but her eyes betrayed her disgust. He uses medicines to make the children sleep, then procedures. Looking for the part of the mind that allows Nolly to see what others cannot. That's barbaric, Silas said, anger rising in his chest. Yes, and yet is it so different from what your doctors did during the war, experimenting on the wounded and dying? Her gaze was challenging. Or does it only become barbaric when done to white children? The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Silas had witnessed army surgeons use wounded soldiers, particularly black soldiers, as subjects for experimental procedures, often without consent or proper anesthesia. It's wrong no matter who it's done to, he said quietly. I never participated in those experiments. Refused, actually. Nearly got court-martialed for it. Something in Dakota's expression softened. Then you are a rare man, Silas Harlow. They fell silent, the crackling fire and howling wind, the only sounds in the small cabin. Nolly had moved from the window to sit before the hearth, her hands moving in complex patterns as if weaving invisible threads. What is she doing? Silas asked. Talking. Dakota replied simply. To whom? The spirits who gather here. Seeing his skepticism, she added, your wife, perhaps, others who have passed through this place. Silas watched the girl's graceful movements, a strange discomfort settling in his stomach. There's no one here but us. That you can see. Dakota's gaze was steady. Your science does not explain everything, healer. There are spaces between what is known where truth still hides. Before Silas could respond, Nolly made a soft sound and pointed to the daguerreotype of Elizabeth. She then pointed to the empty space beside Silas, making the flowing gesture he'd seen before. What is she saying? Well, he asked, a chill creeping up his spine despite his rational mind's protests. Dakota spoke to Nolly and Crow listened to the girl's silent response, then turned to Silas. She says your wife stands beside you often, that she has gentle eyes and hands that help many. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. Elizabeth had been a nurse during the war, known for her gentle touch with the wounded. She could have guessed that. The photograph. She says Elizabeth died with your child inside her. Dakota continued, her voice softening. That she was afraid but not in pain at the end. The sickness took her quickly. Silas stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. That's enough. She says Elizabeth wishes you would forgive yourself. That her death was not your failure. I said enough. Silas's voice cracked like a whip in the small space. Nolly flinched, shrinking back against Dakota, who wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders. A heavy silence filled the cabin. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees like a chorus of the damned. I'm sorry, Silas said, finally running a hand over his face. I can't. It is difficult to face what we do not understand. Dakota said, her tone neither judgmental nor pitying, especially when it touches old wounds. Silas moved to the door, grabbing his coat. I need air. The storm. I won't go far. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, snow driving into his face with needle-like intensity. He welcomed the pain. It was real, tangible, unlike the ghostly conversation happening inside his cabin. He trudged through knee-deep drifts to the stable, seeking refuge in the familiar smells of hay and horse. Inside, he leaned against a wooden post and took several deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. What Nolly had supposedly seen was accurate. Elizabeth had indeed died carrying their child, taken by the influenza epidemic that had swept through the army camp where they both served. And he had blamed himself, believing that if he'd insisted they return home sooner, if he'd recognized the symptoms earlier. Coincidence, he muttered. Or Dakota learned it somehow. Someone in town who knew me before. But even as he formed the words, he knew they rang hollow. He'd told no one in these parts about Elizabeth's pregnancy. It had been too painful to speak of a private grief he'd carried alone. One of the horses nickered softly, pressing its velvety nose against Silas's hand. He stroked the animal absently, finding comfort in its solid presence. What do you think, old friend? Am I losing my mind? The horse offered no opinion, merely continuing to nuzzle his palm in search of treats. Silas stayed in the stable until his fingers grew numb with cold, then reluctantly made his way back to the cabin. Inside, he found Dakota alone by the fire, Nolly already asleep on a pallet of furs in the corner. I've upset you, Dakota said without preamble. It was not my intention. Silas hung his coat by the door. It's not your fault. I'm just not accustomed to having my personal history laid bare by a child who couldn't possibly know it. And yet she does. Dakota gestured to the chair across from her. Sit, please. There are things you should understand if we are to trust each other. Silas hesitated, then sat. The fire had burned low, casting their faces in a warm golden glow that softened the hard edges of Dakota's scar. Nolly's gift is rare even among our people, she began. Most spirit seers receive only impressions, feelings. Nolly sees clearly, faces, hears voices. The spirits speak to her as clearly as you and I speak now. You believe this, Silas said. It wasn't a question. I have seen proof too many times to doubt. Dakota's gaze was steady. She knew of my brother's death before the messenger arrived. She found the body of a lost child by following the child's spirit. She has spoken of things no one could have told her, things that were later proven true. There are charlatans in every city who claim the same abilities, Silas argued. They use tricks, cold reading. Nolly is 9 years old. Dakota interrupted gently. She has no interest in deception. Her gift brings her more pain than joy. Pain? The dead do not always rest easy. Some are angry, confused. They crowd around her, demanding to be heard. Dakota glanced at the sleeping child. It is why she rarely speaks aloud. There are already too many voices in her mind. Silas followed her gaze, noting the peaceful expression on Nolly's face as she slept. It was hard to reconcile the image of this small, vulnerable child with someone capable of communing with the dead. This Dr. Blackwood, he said, changing the subject. What exactly does he want with her? Dakota's expression darkened. He believes Nolly can help him speak with the dead, that he can use her abilities to open a door between worlds. For what purpose? Power, knowledge, perhaps immortality itself. She shook her head. I do not pretend to understand the mind of a madman. I know only that he has killed children in his quest, and he will not stop until he has Nolly. Or until someone stops him, Silas said quietly. Dakota studied him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You would stand against him, a man you do not know, for people not your own. I stand against anyone who harms children, Silas replied simply. Indian or white makes no difference. A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. Then perhaps there is hope for your kind, yet Silas Harlow. The fire popped and hissed as a log collapsed into embers. Outside, the storm continued its assault, But inside the cabin, something shifted, not quite trust, but the beginning of understanding. You should rest, Dakota said, rising gracefully despite her obvious exhaustion. I will watch over Nolly. Take the bed, Silas offered. I'll sleep by the fire. Dakota hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. As she moved toward the bed, Silas noticed her slight limp, the way she favored her right leg. You're injured. It is nothing, an old wound. Let me see, he insisted, the medic in him taking over. Infection is the enemy of healing. Yes, I know. There was a hint of amusement in her voice. Very well, healer, if it will ease your mind. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled up her legging to reveal a half-healed gash along her calf, angry and red at the edges. This needs cleaning, Silas said, already moving to a shelf of supplies. How did it happen? One of Blackwood's men. A knife during our escape. She watched as he gathered alcohol-clean bandages and a jar of honey, a natural antiseptic he'd learned about during the war. You have a gentle touch for a soldier. Had plenty of practice. Silas knelt and began cleaning the wound with careful hands. This will sting. Dakota didn't flinch as he applied the alcohol, her only reaction a slight tightening around her eyes. When he finished dressing the wound, she thanked him with a nod. You should have mentioned this earlier, he chided. It could have festered. There were more important concerns. She glanced at Nolly. She always comes first. She's not your child, yet you risk everything for her. She is my responsibility. My purpose. Dakota's voice was soft but firm. We all need purpose, Silas Harlow. Even you hiding on this mountain with your ghosts. The observation struck closer to home than Silas cared to admit. He stood gathering his medical supplies. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. That night, as Silas lay on his bedroll near the fire, he found himself watching the sleeping forms of his unexpected guests. Dakota's words echoed in his mind. We all need purpose. For 5 years, his only purpose had been survival, putting one foot in front of the other, moving through each day until exhaustion granted him sleep without dreams. Now suddenly he found himself responsible for 2 lives entangled in a story far larger than his solitary existence. What do you think, Elizabeth? He whispered to the darkness. Am I a fool to get involved? No answer came, but as he drifted towards sleep, he could have sworn he felt the ghost of a touch on his cheek, gentle, familiar, like a blessing. Or perhaps it was just the wind finding its way through the cracks in his carefully constructed isolation. Morning arrived with merciful calm, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Sunlight glinted off the fresh snow, transforming the world outside the cabin into a pristine expanse of white. Silas woke to the smell of coffee brewing, a luxury he rarely indulged in, saving the precious beans for special occasions. Dakota stood at the small stove, her movements practiced and efficient despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Nolly sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, watching with solemn eyes as Dakota worked. You found my coffee, Silas observed, sitting up and running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. Hope you don't mind. Dakota didn't turn. Seemed like a morning that needed it. Can't argue with that. He stood folding his bedroll. How's your leg? Better, your medicine helped. Silas moved to the window, assessing the weather. Storms passed. Trail down to the valley will be buried, though. Take a day, maybe 2, before it's passable. Then we have a day, maybe 2. Dakota poured coffee into tin cups, handing one to Silas. Their fingers brushed momentarily, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth up his arm. We should use the time wisely. Meaning we should learn to trust each other. She sat beside Nolly, her scarred face unreadable. If Blackwood's men come, we'll need to work together. Silas sipped his coffee, considering her words. The rational part of him, the part that had kept him alive through war and grief, said to avoid entanglement, to help them on their way and return to his solitude. But another part, a part he'd thought long dead, stirred with something like purpose. Tell me more about this Blackwood, he said finally. What exactly is he after? Dakota glanced at Nolly, who was now drawing patterns in a small patch of condensation on the window. It began with genuine research, I believe. He was interested in our healing practices, our understanding of death and what lies beyond. She sipped her coffee. Many white doctors dismissed our medicine as superstition, but Blackwood was different. He listened, learned. When did it change? After he lost his wife. Dakota's voice softened. Charlotte, Consumption took her 3 winters ago. Blackwood broke. His interest in death became obsession. He began seeking out medicine men, tribal elders, who spoke of journeying to the spirit world and returning. Then he turned to those with natural gifts, healers, seers, especially children, whose abilities were still developing. Silas frowned. And the army allowed this. The army sees what it wishes to see. A respected doctor conducting research on savages. Her tone was bitter. Why would they interfere? Nolly made a small gesture, catching Dakota's attention. They exchanged looks in silent communication. What did she say? Silas asked. She says there were others like her. 7 children, all gone now. A chill ran through Silas that had nothing to do with the winter air. He killed them. Not intentionally, perhaps, but his procedures were not gentle, and when they failed to give him what he sought, he pushed harder. Dakota's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her face. I helped Nolly escape when I realized what was happening. He gave me this as a parting gift. Silas studied the scar more carefully now. A clean surgical cut, not the jagged wound of combat or accident. He did that deliberately, a reminder, he said, of the cost of betrayal. Dakota's gaze was steady. I would bear 100 such scars to keep Nolly from his hands. Silas nodded slowly, understanding. During the war, he'd seen men endure unimaginable suffering to protect those they loved. Dakota's devotion to Nolly was no different, despite the lack of blood relation. You said you worked with army doctors, he said. As a translator, an assistant, I learned their medicine while teaching them ours. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I was a curiosity to them, an Indian woman who could read, write, speak English. They thought me an exception, a civilized savage. But you were more than that. I was a healer in my own right. My grandmother taught me our ways from childhood. She set down her cup. Different methods, same purpose as your medicine. To mend what is broken. Silas found himself studying her hands, strong, capable with the same calluses he recognized on his own from years of medical work. Hands that had stitched wounds, set bones, eased suffering. Show me, he said suddenly. Dakota raised an eyebrow. Show you what? Your medicine. I showed you mine last night. He gestured to her bandaged leg. Fair exchange. For the first time, Dakota looked genuinely surprised. You want to learn tribal healing practices? I want to learn anything that might help save lives. Silas shrugged. Knowledge doesn't care where it comes from, only how it's used. Something shifted in Dakota's expression, a subtle softening, the first crack in her carefully maintained reserve. Very well, healer. We will exchange knowledge. Throughout that day, as snow melted slowly under the winter sun, Silas and Dakota shared their respective medical skills. She showed him how to prepare poultices from pine resin and certain barks that fought infection as effectively as his carbolic acid, but without the painful burning. He demonstrated proper suturing techniques that reduced scarring. They discovered to mutual surprise that many of their methods served the same purpose through different means. Nolly watched their exchanges with quiet interest, occasionally bringing them objects from outside specific plants. Dakota requested even those buried under snow, which the girls seemed to locate with uncanny precision. She feels their energy, Dakota explained when Silas remarked on this ability. All living things speak if one knows how to listen. By late afternoon, Silas found himself genuinely impressed by Dakota's knowledge. You would have made a fine physician, he commented as they organized the day's collected herbs. In another life. In another world, perhaps. She didn't look up from her work. This one is not ready for such things. The world changes, Silas offered. Slowly, but it does. Not quickly enough for some of us. There was no bitterness in her tone, merely acceptance of a truth both understood. As dusk approached, Silas prepared a stew from preserved venison and wild onions Nolly had somehow found beneath the snow. They ate in companionable silence, the earlier tension between them eased by a day of shared purpose. Later, as Nolly slept and the fire burned low, Dakota and Silas sat before the hearth with the remains of the coffee. May I ask about your wife? Dakota said quietly. Silas tensed slightly, then relaxed. After what Nolly had revealed, there seemed little point in privacy. Elizabeth. She was a nurse during the war. That's how we met, patching up the same wounded soldiers. He stared into the flames. Influenza took her in '67. She was carrying our first child. I am sorry. The simple words carried genuine weight. To lose both at once is a heavy burden, some days heavier than others. Silas took a sip of coffee, its warmth a poor substitute for the comfort he sought. What about you, family? Dead or scattered, the reservation system has not been kind to my people. Dakota's gaze remained on the fire. I had a husband once. He died at Little Bighorn. Silas nodded, understanding all that remained unsaid. The war between the army and the native tribes had left countless widows on both sides. And yet you worked with army doctors after that. I go where I am needed. Hatred does not heal wounds, theirs or ours. She glanced at Nolly's sleeping form. Now I am needed here with her. What will you do if you escape Blackwood, I mean? Dakota considered the question. Find a place where Nolly can learn to control her gift. There are elders among the northern tribes who understand such things. Beyond that, she shrugged, I have learned not to plan too far ahead. Wise policy, Silas agreed. The future has a way of ignoring our plans. They fell into silence again, but it was different now, companionable rather than wary. Outside, an owl called into the night, its lonely cry echoing across the snow-covered ridge. She is not what I expected, Dakota said after a while. Who? You're Elizabeth. At Silas's startled look, she continued, Nolly speaks of her, says she stands behind you now, her hand on your shoulder. Silas fought the urge to look behind him, to brush at his shoulder where he suddenly felt a phantom weight. What? What does she say? That you were her strength during life, and she wishes to be yours now. Dakota's voice was gentle. That she never blamed you for what happened. A lump formed in Silas's throat. Convenient messages from beyond the grave. Believe or don't, it changes nothing. Dakota rose, stretching her tall frame. But Nolly does not lie, Silas Harlow. Not about this. She moved to the bed, leaving Silas alone with the dying fire and thoughts he'd spent 5 years trying to outrun. The next morning broke clear in cold sunlight, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Silas stepped onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, surveying the pristine expanse stretching down toward the valley below. The trail would be passable by afternoon if the sun held. The thought brought an unexpected pang. In just 2 days, he had grown accustomed to the quiet presence of Dakota and Nolly in his cabin. The prospect of returning to solitude felt less like relief and more like loss. Movement caught his eye, Nolly wading through knee-deep snow at the edge of the clearing, her small form bundled in one of his old coats. She appeared to be searching for something, occasionally stopping to dig with mittened hands. Silas watched her for a moment, then stepped off the porch and made his way toward her. Morning, he called softly, not wanting to startle her. What are you looking for? Nolly glanced up, her dark eyes serious. She pointed downward, then made a flowing gesture with her hands. I don't understand, Silas admitted. The girl sighed, then took his hand, tugging him to follow. She led him to a spot near a large pine where she began digging more determinedly through the snow. After a moment, her fingers closed around something. She held it up triumphantly, a small leather pouch intricately beaded. What is it? Silas asked. Nolly opened the pouch and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn at the edges. She handed it to Silas with solemn ceremony. Curious, he unfolded it carefully. It was a rough map drawn in a precise hand he recognized immediately as military cartography. The map showed a section of territory to the north with X marks at several locations and notations in a cramped, educated script. Where did you get this? He asked, though he knew she wouldn't answer verbally. Nolly pointed to Dakota, who now stood on the porch watching them. She's had it all along, Dakota called, descending the steps. It was sewn into the lining of her dress when you found her. Silas studied the map more carefully. These are survey markers, Army survey by the look of it. He glanced up at Dakota. What is this incurrence? She replied, coming to stand beside them. And the real reason Blackwood wants Nolly. Explain. Dakota took the map, her fingers tracing the marked locations. Gold deposits, rich ones according to Blackwood's surveys, on Crowland land that by treaty cannot be mined without tribal consent. Understanding dawned, and the tribe hasn't given consent. Nor will they. These sites include sacred grounds, burial places. Dakota's expression hardened. Blackwood discovered them while stationed at Fort Ellis. He's been quietly planning to exploit them once he finds a way around the treaty. And this map proves it, Silas concluded. Evidence of intent to violate federal treaty. Dakota nodded. One of many reasons he cannot allow us to escape. Beyond his scientific interest in Nolly's abilities, he needs this map and the knowledge it represents. Silas stared at the innocent-looking document, understanding now the weight it carried. Why show me this? Because you deserve to know what you're involved in. Dakota met his gaze directly. And because I believe you are a man who stands by his choices once made. The implication was clear. He was being offered a final opportunity to step away, to return to his solitude and safety. To pretend he had never found a half-frozen child in the snow, never met a scarred woman with ancient wisdom in her eyes. Silas looked from Dakota to Nolly, who watched him with that unnervingly adult gaze. Then down at the map that represented not just gold, but the systematic exploitation of a people already pushed to the margins of their own land. We should prepare, he said finally. If the trail's clear by afternoon, Blackwood's men won't be far behind. Relief flickered briefly in Dakota's eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive this. Silas folded the map and handed it back to Nolly, who returned it to its pouch with careful reverence. Let's get inside. We have plans to make. Throughout the morning they prepared as best they could. Silas cleaned and loaded his rifles and revolver, while Dakota fashioned additional arrows for her bow. They packed supplies, food, medicines, bandages, anything that might be needed if they were forced to flee. Nolly helped in her own way, gathering specific herbs at Dakota's direction and arranging them in small bundles. At one point, she tugged on Silas's sleeve and handed him a small, carved wooden figure, a horse roughly shaped but recognizable. Did you make this? He asked, surprised. She nodded, then pointed to him. For me. Another nod. Thank you. It's well done. The girl smiled, the first true smile he'd seen from her, then returned to her work. The simple gift touched Silas more deeply than he cared to admit, a small kindness he had done nothing to deserve. By midday, the sun had done its work. The trail down to the valley, while still snow-covered, was navigable. Silas stood on the porch, surveying the landscape with a practiced eye, searching for any sign of approaching danger. We should leave tomorrow at first light, Dakota said, joining him. Head north toward the Blackfoot territory. I have friends there who will help us. Silas nodded. I'll go with you as far as the pass. After that, you return to your solitude. Dakota finished for him. There was no judgment in her tone, merely acceptance. It's better that way. She studied him, her dark eyes penetrating. This cabin holds many ghosts, Silas Harlow. Not all of them bring peace. Before he could respond, Nolly appeared in the doorway, her expression alert. She made a series of quick gestures to Dakota, whose body instantly tensed. What is it? Silas asked. Someone comes, Dakota said, her voice low. From the south, a single rider. Silas reached for his rifle propped against the wall. Get inside, both of you. We stand together, Dakota countered, already stringing her bow. This is our fight too. There was no time to argue. Silas could now see the approaching figure, a lone horseman, moving steadily up the trail, the animal's breath visible in the cold air. Not the organized party he'd expected if it were Blackwood's men, but caution was warranted nonetheless. Behind the woodpile, he directed Dakota. Clear shot from there if needed. She nodded, guiding Nolly with her as they moved to the position. Silas stepped off the porch, rifle ready, but not raised, positioning himself in the open, where he could be seen clearly. The rider approached slowly, eventually resolving into a familiar figure, Tom Jensen, one of the homesteaders from the valley below. Silas lowered his rifle slightly, but remained wary. Afternoon, Harlow, Jensen called as he drew his horse to a stop 20 yards out. Quite a storm we had. Jensen, Silas nodded in greeting. Long ride up here, something wrong? Might be. Jensen remained mounted, his weathered face grim beneath his hat. Strangers in town asking questions. Looking for an Indian woman and child. Offering good money for information. Silas kept his expression neutral. Plenty of Indians pass through these parts. Not like these they described. Woman with a scar on her face. Child who doesn't speak. Jensen's eyes narrowed slightly. They seemed particularly interested in whether anyone had seen them near your place. That's so. Said they were family looking to bring them home. Jensen snorted. Didn't much look like concerned relatives to me. More like the kind of men who'd shoot you for your boots. Appreciate the warning. Jensen shifted in his saddle. There's more. Fellow leading them is some kind of doctor. Well-spoken, educated type. But there's something wrong about his eyes. He hesitated. I fought with you at Antietam Harlow. Don't know what you're mixed up in here and don't much care, but thought you should know they're coming up this way. Tomorrow most like. Silas nodded, grateful for the loyalty of a former comrade in arms. Thanks, Tom, I owe you. Figure we're square now. Jensen gathered his reins. Whatever you're planning, best do it quick. He hesitated. Need any help? No, better you're not involved. Jensen nodded, understanding. Good luck then. He turned his horse and began the descent back toward the valley. Silas watched until he disappeared around a bend, then turned to find Dakota and Nolly emerging from their hiding place. We have less time than we thought, Dakota said quietly. We leave tonight, Silas decided. As soon as it's dark. They'll expect us to wait until morning. Dakota studied him. Us? I know these mountains better than anyone. There are paths, caves where we can hide. Silas met her gaze steadily. I'll see you safely to the Blackfoot territory. A long moment passed between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Dakota nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Silas repeated, though with less conviction than before. We still have to make it. They spent the remaining daylight in careful preparation, packing only what was essential, planning their route, preparing the horses. Silas found himself watching Dakota as she worked, admiring the efficient grace of her movements, the quiet authority with which she directed Nolly. There was something compelling about her, a strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with an unshakable core of purpose. As the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, Dakota paused in her preparations to join Silas at the map he had spread on the table. The most direct route would be through Blacktail Pass, he explained, tracing the path with his finger. But that's likely where they'll look first. Instead, we'll go east through the narrow canyon, then north along the ridge. It's longer but less traveled. Dakota studied the map. Difficult terrain. In places, but we can make good time if the weather holds. He glanced out the window at the clear schema. New moon tonight. Good for travel, bad for visibility. Nolly can see in darkness better than most, Dakota said. Another gift, or curse, depending on perspective. Silas nodded, accepting the information without comment. After what he'd witnessed, he was beyond questioning the girl's unusual abilities. As they finished their preparations, Silas found himself reluctant to leave the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 3 years. Foolish sentiment, he knew it was just wood and stone, a structure built by human hands. Yet it contained all that remained of his former life, including the daguerreotype of Elizabeth. On impulse, he removed the photograph from its frame and carefully tucked it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. The rest he would leave behind. Material possessions meant little compared to the lives at stake. Darkness fell like a heavy blanket, stars emerging in a sky so clear and cold they seemed to shiver. Silas led the horses from the stable, each loaded with supplies, but not so heavily as to slow their progress. Dakota helped Nolly onto one mount, then swung herself up behind the child with fluid grace. Silas took a final look at the cabin, dark now, as though already abandoned. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing on the porch, a woman in a nurse's apron, her hand raised in farewell. Then he blinked, and there was nothing but shadows. Ready? Dakota asked quietly. Silas nodded, turning away from the apparition, real or imagined. Stay close, the trail's tricky in the dark. They set off into the night, 3 souls bound by circumstance and choice, leaving behind the solitary refuge that had sheltered them. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, the possibility of failure. Yet as they rode beneath the vast canopy of stars, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of rightness, of purpose, beyond mere survival. Whether it would be enough to save them remained to be seen. They traveled through the night, following game trails and forgotten paths that wound through the dense pine forest. The cold was intense, their breath crystallizing in the air, but the sky remained clear, stars providing just enough light to navigate by. Nolly rode before Dakota, occasionally pointing out obstacles or turns before Silas himself noticed them. Her ability to perceive the landscape in near total darkness was uncanny, but Silas had ceased questioning such things. He simply followed her guidance when offered, grateful for any advantage. They stopped briefly near midnight to rest the horses and drink hot coffee from a flask Silas had prepared. Standing in a small clearing, surrounded by the immense silence of the winter forest, they spoke in whispers, though there was no one to hear. How far to this canyon you mentioned? Dakota asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. Another 2 hours, maybe 3. Silas stamped his feet to keep the blood flowing. It's narrow, barely wide enough for a horse in places. But it cuts through the eastern ridge and puts us beyond where they're likely to search. Dakota nodded, adjusting the blanket wrapped around Nolly, who leaned against her, eyes half closed with exhaustion. She needs proper rest soon. The cold drains her strength. There's a hunter's cabin near the northern exit of the canyon, Silas said. Abandoned years ago, but the roof was sound last I checked. We can stop there until nightfall tomorrow. As they prepared to continue, Nolly suddenly stiffened, her eyes opening wide. She tugged at Dakota's sleeve, making urgent gestures. What is it? Silas asked, instantly alert. Dakota frowned, interpreting the girl's silent communication. She says we're being followed. Not close, but coming from the south. Men with bosses. Silas turned, scanning the dark forest behind them. He saw nothing, heard nothing beyond the soft nickering of the horses and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Are you sure? He asked, directing the question to Nolly. The girl nodded emphatically, then held up 4 fingers. 4 men, Dakota translated. And dogs hunting dogs, she thinks, following our trail. Impossible, Silas muttered. We've been careful. No one could track us in this darkness. Dogs don't need light to follow a scent, Dakota reminded him. And Nolly, she hesitated. Nolly sometimes knows things before they happen. Silas wanted to dismiss the warning as childhood fear or imagination, but the memory of Nolly's accurate knowledge about Elizabeth gave him pause. Then we need to move faster. The canyon will be harder to track through lots of stone-running water to mask our scent. They mounted quickly, pushing the horses to a faster pace despite the treacherous footing. Silas led them off the trail several times, cutting through dense underbrush and across shallow streams, anything to break their scent trail and confuse pursuit. Dawn was still hours away when they reached the entrance to the canyon, a narrow cleft in a towering wall of granite barely visible until they were upon it. A small stream flowed from its mouth, gurgling softly over rocks worn smooth by centuries of patient erosion. Single file from here, Silas instructed, dismounting to lead his horse. Watch your head in places. The walls narrow. They proceeded carefully, the sounds of their passage amplified by the stone walls rising on either side. The air grew colder, damper as they ventured deeper into the passage. In places, the walls closed in so tightly they had to urge the horses through sideways, the animals nervous but compliant. The canyon twisted and turned, following the ancient path of water through stone. After nearly an hour of careful progress, it widened slightly into a small grotto where the stream pooled around a cluster of boulders before continuing its journey. Here Silas called a halt. Let the horses drink, he said. We're about halfway through. As Dakota helped Nolly down, Silas climbed one of the larger boulders, hoping for a better vantage point. The canyon walls rose sheer on either side, reaching toward a strip of star-filled sky that seemed impossibly distant. No sign of pursuit, but the enclosed space made it difficult to see far in either direction. He rejoined the others, finding Dakota kneeling beside the pool, filling their water flasks. Nolly stood nearby, her small face tilted upward, studying the stars visible through the narrow opening above. Any sign? Dakota asked without looking up. Nothing yet. Silas took a drink from his flask. But if they have dogs, they'll find the canyon eventually. Then we keep moving. She rose fluidly despite the evident fatigue in her face. The further ahead we stay, the better our chances. As they prepared to continue, Nolly suddenly went still, her attention fixed on something across the pool. She raised her hand, pointing. Silas followed her gesture but saw nothing except shadows in stone. What is it? Nolly made a series of quick signs to Dakota, whose expression grew concerned. She sees someone, Dakota explained quietly. A man watching us. Silas reached for his rifle. Where, not a living man, Dakota clarified. A spirit. She says he's been following us since we entered the canyon. Despite his rational mind's protest, Silas found himself scanning the shadows more intently. Friend or foe? Dakota relayed the question. Nolly considered, then shrugged, a surprisingly childlike gesture from one so serious. She doesn't know, Dakota said, but she thinks he wants to show us something. Now isn't the time for ghost stories, Silas said more sharply than intended. We need to keep moving. Dakota gave him a level look. Nolly's visions have saved our lives before. I don't ignore them even when inconvenient. Before Silas could respond, Nolly moved purposefully toward the far side of the grotto, where the canyon continued its winding path. She stopped at an unremarkable section of wall, running her small hands over the stone surface. "What is she doing?" Silas asked, following reluctantly. "Following the spirit's guidance, I think." Dakota joined them, watching as Nolly continued her careful exploration of the rock face. "She says he's showing her something hidden." Silas was about to insist they continue when Nolly made a small sound of discovery. Her fingers had found a narrow crevice barely visible in the dim light. She looked up at Silas expectantly. "It's just a crack in the rock," he began, but curiosity got the better of him. He examined the crevice more closely, running his own fingers along its length. It was unnaturally straight, extending about 6 feet vertically before disappearing into shadow. On impulse, he pressed his shoulder against the section of wall containing the crevice and pushed. Nothing happened at first, then with a grating sound, a portion of the rock face moved inward, revealing a dark opening beyond. A hidden passage. Dakota breathed, clearly surprised. Silas retrieved his lantern from his pack, lit it, and held it toward the opening. The light revealed a narrow tunnel extending into darkness, its floor smooth as though worn by the passage of many feet over time. "Old mining operation, maybe," he mused. "Or something older." Nolly tugged at his sleeve, pointing into the tunnel, then making the sign for a man. "The spirit wants us to follow," Dakota translated. Silas hesitated. The sensible course was to continue through the canyon as planned. Yet the tunnel offered an alternative route one their pursuers might not discover. "How far does it go?" he asked Nolly, knowing she couldn't answer directly. The girl extended her arm fully, then made a circular motion, far and turning. "Worth investigating," Dakota suggested. "At the very least, it might provide a place to hide the horses while we scout ahead." After a moment's consideration, Silas nodded. "I'll go first. Stay close and be ready to turn back if needed." The tunnel was higher and wider than it had first appeared, allowing them to lead the horses single file without difficulty. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting ventilation from somewhere ahead. Silas proceeded cautiously, lantern held high alert for any sign of danger. They had traveled perhaps 100 yards when the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Silas raised the lantern, revealing a space that stole his breath, not a natural cave, but a room carved from living rock. The walls were smooth, adorned with faded pictographs in ochre and black. Stone benches lined the perimeter, and at the center stood a circular platform raised slightly above the floor. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice echoing softly. Dakota moved beside him, her expression one of wonder. "A sacred site, very old." She studied the pictographs. "These are ancient, older than my people's memory. A place of passage, I think. Passage to where? Between worlds, perhaps." She glanced at Nolly, who had entered the chamber with obvious reverence, her small face solemn. The old ones believed there were thin places where the veil between life and death could be crossed more easily. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air. "You're saying this is some kind of doorway to the afterlife?" "I'm saying it was built by people who believed it was." Dakota's tone was measured. "Whether their belief made it so, that is a different question." Nolly had moved her to the central platform, where she now stood with her eyes closed, hands slightly raised, as if feeling for something invisible. "What's she doing?" Silas asked. "Listening," Dakota replied simply. "This place is very old, very sacred. For one with her gifts, it must be overwhelming." After a moment, Nolly opened her eyes and turned to them, her expression troubled. She made a series of urgent gestures to Dakota. "She says there are many spirits here." Dakota translated, her own voice hushed. "Some ancient, some newer, and one who knows you, Silas Harlow." "Me." The word came out harsher than intended. "That's not possible. I've never been here before." Nolly approached him slowly, her dark eyes fixed on his face. She reached up and touched his chest, just over his heart, where Elizabeth's photograph rested in his pocket. "Elizabeth," Dakota said softly. "Nolly says she's here, that she's been trying to reach you." Silas stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I don't believe in—" "Belief doesn't change what is," Dakota interrupted gently. "Only our ability to perceive it." A sound from the tunnel entrance cut short any further discussion, a distant bark echoing off stone walls. "The dogs," Silas said, instantly alert. "They've found the canyon." Dakota was already moving, guiding Nolly toward the far side of the chamber, where another tunnel led deeper into the mountain. "Is there another way out?" I don't know, I've never. Silas stopped realizing the futility of explanation. We'll find out, quickly now. They hurried through the second tunnel, Silas leading with the lantern, the horses following, reluctantly sensing their rider's urgency. Behind them, the barking grew louder, punctuated now by men's voices, faint but drawing closer. The passage twisted and turned occasionally, opening into smaller chambers, similar to the first, but less elaborately decorated. Signs of ancient habitation were everywhere: fire pits, stone tools, faded drawings on walls. A city within the mountain abandoned centuries ago. After what seemed an eternity of tense progress, they emerged into a final chamber larger than any before. Here, a shaft of pale light filtered down from above, revealing a natural chimney in the rock ceiling that led to the surface. "There's our way out," Silas said, relief evident in his voice. "But the horses can't climb it." Dakota assessed the shaft. "Too steep for us as well without equipment. There has to be another exit. These people wouldn't have built a settlement with only one way in or out." Silas raised the lantern, searching the chamber's perimeter. "There, that passage looks wider than the others." They followed the indicated tunnel, moving as quickly as caution allowed. The sounds of pursuit had faded, suggesting their hunters had either lost their trail or chosen a different path through the canyon. The tunnel gradually sloped upward, the air growing fresher, cooler. After several hundred yards, it ended abruptly at what appeared to be a wall of dense brush and fallen rock. "Dead end," Dakota said, disappointment evident. "Maybe not." Silas handed her the lantern and began clearing away branches and smaller stones. "Feel that air. There's an opening beyond this." Working together, they cleared enough debris to reveal a narrow gap barely wide enough for a horse to squeeze through sideways. Beyond lay daylight in what appeared to be a small, sheltered valley surrounded by steep cliffs. "We made it," Dakota breathed as they emerged into the open air, thanks to Nolly's spirit guide. Silas didn't comment on the supernatural aspect, too relieved at their escape to debate. The valley was a natural fortress, accessible only through the tunnel they'd just traversed or via a steep game trail that wound up the far cliff face. A small stream provided fresh water, and scattered pines offered shelter from above. "The cabin I mentioned is about 5 miles north of here," he said, getting his bearings from the position of the rising sun. "But this might be safer for now. Natural protection water and hidden from view." Dakota nodded agreement. "We should rest while we can. None of us have slept properly in 2 days." They made a simple camp beneath a cluster of pines, using the skills of both cultures, Silas's practical military efficiency and Dakota's native knowledge of how to remain hidden while in plain sight. Nolly, exhausted from the journey and her spiritual exertions, fell asleep, almost immediately curled beneath blankets near the small, smokeless fire Dakota had constructed. As morning light filtered through the pine branches, Silas and Dakota sat side by side, sharing the last of the coffee from Silas's flask. "That place in the mountain," Silas said after a long silence. "What do you think it was really?" Dakota considered the question. "A holy place. Beyond that." She shrugged. "There are mysteries in this world that defy simple explanations, Silas Harlow. My people understand this. Yours try to capture mystery in glass bottles and scientific papers." "Science has answered many mysteries," he countered, but without conviction, "and created new ones." Dakota's gaze was steady. "Your doctors can stop a heart and start it again. Is that so different from the spirit journeys our medicine men undertake? Different methods, same border crossing." Silas had no ready answer for that. He stared into the small fire, watching flames dance over carefully arranged pine needles that produced heat with minimal smoke. "What Nolly said about Elizabeth," he began, then faltered. "You want to know if it's true?" Dakota's voice was gentle. "If your wife's spirit truly walks beside you." "I want to know if I'm losing my mind," he admitted, "seeing things that aren't there because I wish they were." The mind is a powerful thing. It can create illusions to protect itself from pain. She studied his face. "But that doesn't mean all visions are illusions." "How do you tell the difference?" "You don't, not with certainty." She set down her cup. "But consider this, if Elizabeth's spirit truly watches over you, would knowing this bring you peace or pain?" Silas considered the question honestly. "Both, I think. Peace to know she's not simply gone. Pain to be reminded of what I've lost." "Then perhaps the question isn't whether it's true, but whether the truth serves life or death." Dakota's gaze was compassionate. Some mysteries are better left unexplored until we're ready for their answers. They fell silent again, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. In the distance, a hawk circled against the pale morning sky, free and solitary. "You should sleep," Dakota said finally. "I'll keep watch." "Wake me in 4 hours," Silas instructed, already settling onto his bedroll. "We'll need to move again by dusk." As he drifted towards sleep, exhaustion finally claiming him, Silas thought he felt a familiar touch on his cheek, gentle, loving, like a blessing. Elizabeth, or just the mountain breeze? In his last conscious moment, he decided it didn't matter. The comfort was real regardless of its source. Silas woke to the sound of quiet conversation. For a moment, still caught in the haze between sleep and wakefulness, he thought he heard Elizabeth's voice, that gentle lilt he'd fallen in love with during long nights tending the wounded. Then clarity returned, and he recognized Dakota's deeper tones, speaking softly in the Crow language. He opened his eyes to find the sun high overhead, its light filtering through pine branches in dappled patterns. He had slept longer than the 4 hours he'd specified, much longer, judging by the quality of light. Sitting up, he spotted Dakota and Nolly seated by the small fire which had been carefully maintained. They were engaged in what appeared to be a lesson of some kind, with Dakota demonstrating a series of hand gestures that Nolly mimicked with serious concentration. "You let me oversleep," Silas said, his voice rough with rest. Dakota looked up, unapologetic. "You needed it, and there's been no sign of pursuit." "Still, we agreed on 4 hours. He stood, stretching muscles stiff from riding and cold. "What time is it?" "Midday or close to it." Dakota handed him a cup of water. "We have time yet before we need to move." Silas drank deeply, realizing how thirsty he was. "What were you teaching her?" "Old signs, ways to speak with spirits." Dakota's expression was thoughtful. "Nolly has the sight but lacks control. She sees too much all at once. It overwhelms her." "Like trying to hear one voice in a crowded room," Silas suggested. "Exactly so." Dakota seemed pleased by his understanding. "These signs help focus her attention, like closing one eye to aim a rifle." Nolly looked up at Silas, then made a deliberate gesture, fingers to her eyes, then extending outward toward him. "What does that mean?" he asked. "I see you," Dakota translated. "Not just with her eyes, but with her spirit. It's a sign of respect." Moved by the simple ceremony, Silas returned the gesture as best he could. Nolly smiled, a rare, luminous expression that transformed her solemn face into that of an ordinary child, if only for a moment. They shared a simple meal of jerky and dried berries, conserving their supplies for the journey ahead. As they ate, Silas studied the valley that had provided their refuge, a natural fortress, with steep cliffs on 3 sides and the hidden tunnel entrance on the 4th. An easier place to defend than his cabin had been. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "This place, it's defensible, hidden. Maybe we should stay at least for a few days. Let Blackwood's men waste their time searching elsewhere." Dakota considered the suggestion. "It has merit, but also risk. If they find the tunnel entrance, we'd have warning and the advantage of higher ground." Silas gestured to the cliff tops surrounding them, perfect positions for a marksman. "You're thinking like a soldier again," Dakota observed. "Because we're in a war whether we chose it or not." Silas met her gaze directly. "At least here we can choose the battlefield." After a thoughtful pause, Dakota nodded. "Very well, we stay for now, but we prepare for quick departure if needed." With a decision made, they set about making the valley more secure and comfortable. Silas scouted the perimeter, identifying potential escape routes and defensive positions. Dakota and Nolly gathered additional firewood and fresh pine boughs for bedding. By late afternoon, they had established a camp that was both functional and well-concealed from casual observation. As dusk approached, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature, they gathered around the fire for another simple meal. The day's activities had created a comfortable familiarity between them, a sense of shared purpose that bridged their cultural differences. "May I ask you something?" Silas said as they finished eating. The question had been forming in his mind all day, growing from the seed planted during their exploration of the ancient site within the mountain. "Of course." Dakota set aside her plate, giving him her full attention. "Blackwood, you said he believes there's a door between worlds, that Nolly is somehow a key to opening it." He hesitated. "Do you believe such a thing is possible?" Dakota was silent for a long moment, considering her response. I believe there are places where the boundary between worlds grows thin, places like the chambers we found in the mountain. She glanced at Nolly, who was listening intently. And I believe there are people like Nolly who can see through that boundary more clearly than others. But actually crossing it, a living person entering the realm of the dead. Our legends speak of medicine men who journeyed to the spirit world and returned. But such journeys were of the spirit, not the body. Dakota's expression grew troubled. What Blackwood seeks is different, a physical doorway, a way to cheat death itself. And he thinks Nolly can provide this. He thinks her abilities can be harvested somehow, used to create this doorway. Disgust colored Dakota's voice, as if a child's sacred gift could be cut out and studied like an organ in one of your anatomy books. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. That's monstrous. Yes, and driven by fear, the fear of a man who cannot accept the natural order of life and death. Dakota's gaze returned to the fire. He is dying, you know. Consumption like his wife before him. That is what drives his desperation. The revelation cast Blackwood's actions in a new light, not excusing them, but explaining the frantic quality of his pursuit. A dying man clutching at any chance of survival, no matter how remote or unethical. How do you know this? I was his assistant before I helped Nolly escape. I saw the blood on his handkerchiefs, heard the cough he tried to hide. Dakota's face was grim in the firelight. He has perhaps a year less if the disease progresses quickly. Not much time to unlock the secrets of immortality, Silas observed dryly. No, which makes him all the more dangerous. Dakota looked at Nolly, who had moved to sit beside her, leaning against her arm, with the easy trust of a child with her protector. He will stop at nothing now. The gravity of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They weren't simply running from an unethical doctor or corrupt officials. They were fleeing a desperate man with nothing to lose, the most dangerous kind of enemy. As darkness claimed the valley, they prepared for night. Dakota and Nolly would sleep first, with Silas keeping watch until midnight. Then they would trade places, ensuring someone remained alert throughout the vulnerable hours of darkness. I'll check the perimeter once more before full dark, Silas said, rising and reaching for his rifle. Dakota nodded, already arranging blankets for Nolly, who was fighting to keep her eyes open after the long day. As Silas turned to go, Nolly suddenly sat up straight, her expression alert. She tugged at Dakota's sleeve, making urgent gestures. What is it? Silas asked, instantly tense. Dakota frowned, interpreting Nolly's silent communication. She says someone is coming. Not from the tunnel, but... She looked up at the cliff, face to the west. From above, climbing down. Silas followed her gaze, but saw nothing in the gathering twilight. How many more gestures from Nolly then? Dakota's translation, one man, alone. She says... Dakota paused, her expression puzzled. She says he's not with the others, that he seeks us for a different reason. Friend or foe? She doesn't know, but she doesn't sense threat from him. Silas considered their options. A single man could be a scout for a larger party or someone else entirely. Either way, they needed to be prepared. Get Nolly into the tunnel entrance, he directed. Stay hidden until I signal it's safe. Dakota nodded, gathering Nolly and their essential supplies with practiced efficiency. Within moments, they had disappeared into the concealed tunnel entrance, leaving Silas alone in the growing darkness. He moved to a position that offered both cover and a clear view of the western cliff, rifle ready. The sun had set, but a half moon provided enough light to see by casting silver highlights on the rocky face of the cliff. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then Silas spotted movement, a figure descending the steep path with careful, deliberate movements. As the man reached the valley floor, Silas could make out more details: medium height, dressed in frontier clothing, a rifle slung across his back. He moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to wilderness travel. The stranger paused at the bottom of the path, scanning the valley. His gaze settled on the remains of their fire, still glowing faintly among the pines. I know you are there, the man called, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. I'm not with Blackwood's men. I've come to help. Silas remained silent, a rifle trained on the stranger's chest. My name is Michael Reed, the man continued. I was Blackwood's assistant before Dakota. I know what he's doing and I want to stop him. At the mention of Dakota's name, Silas tensed. This could be a trap, a way to draw them out. If you're there, Dakota, Reed called, I can prove I'm telling the truth. The scar on your face, Blackwood gave it to you the night you helped Nolly escape. I was there. I distracted the guards so you could get away. A soft sound behind Silas indicated Dakota had emerged from hiding. She moved to his side, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. It's true, she whispered. There was someone who helped us that night. I never saw his face. Could be information tortured out of someone else who was there, Silas cautioned. Perhaps. Dakota studied the stranger thoughtfully. But Nolly said he's not with the others. Her instincts about people are rarely wrong. After a moment's consideration, Silas called out, Approach slowly, hands where I can see them. Reed complied, walking toward them with deliberate steps, hands held away from his body. As he drew closer, Silas could see he was younger than expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and a face weathered by outdoor living. That's far enough, Silas ordered when Reed was about 20 feet away. Explain yourself. As I said, I worked with Blackwood. I'm a doctor, or was before I saw what he was doing to those children. Reed's voice was steady, educated. I've been tracking him since I left Fort Ellis last year. When I heard he was pursuing Nolly again, I knew I had to intervene. How did you find us? Dakota asked, speaking for the first time. I was following Blackwood's men. They lost your trail in the canyon, started searching in the wrong direction. A hint of satisfaction colored Reed's tone. I noticed signs they missed, the disturbed brush at the tunnel entrance. Convenient, Silas commented, rifle still ready. I understand your caution, Reed said, but I'm here to help, not harm. Blackwood isn't just after Nolly anymore. He's deteriorating physically and mentally. His experiments have become increasingly dangerous. He was dangerous before, Dakota observed. Yes, but now he's desperate. The consumption is advancing faster than he expected. Reed's expression grew grim. He's convinced Nolly is his last hope for finding a way to cheat death. Silas and Dakota exchanged glances. The information aligned with what they already knew, but that didn't necessarily make Reed trustworthy. What exactly do you want from us? Silas asked. To help you get Nolly somewhere safe, and then to stop Blackwood before he hurts anyone else. Reed lowered his hands slowly. I have information that could help his plans, the routes his men are searching, resources you might need. Before either Silas or Dakota could respond, movement at the tunnel entrance caught their attention. Nolly had emerged, ignoring Dakota's instructions to remain hidden. She approached slowly, her gaze fixed on Reed with that unnervingly direct stare. Nolly, stay back, Dakota warned, but the girl continued forward until she stood directly before the stranger. Reed knelt to her level, meeting her gaze without flinching. Hello, Nolly. Do you remember me? To everyone's surprise, Nolly nodded. Then she did something even more unexpected. She reached out and touched Reed's face gently, as if confirming his identity through touch. She remembers you, Dakota said, her tone indicating this was significant. I brought her water books when I could, Reed explained. Tried to make her captivity less harsh. Nolly turned to Dakota and made a series of gestures, her expression earnest. What is she saying? Silas asked. That he speaks truth, that he has... Dakota frowned, struggling to interpret. Shadows around him, but not within him. Spirits follow him, but he doesn't see them. Reed looked startled. What does that mean? It means she believes you're honest despite your association with Blackwood. Dakota's expression softened slightly, and that you're followed by those you've lost, though you're not aware of their presence. A complex emotion crossed Reed's face, grief perhaps, or longing. My family. They died in a house fire while I was serving in the war. It's why I understand Blackwood's obsession, even as I condemn his methods. I know what it is to want the impossible, to speak with the dead once more. The simple confession, offered without expectation of sympathy, carried the ring of truth. Silas lowered his rifle slightly, though he remained vigilant. If we accept your help, he said carefully, what exactly do you propose? First, to move again at first light. Blackwood's men will eventually find this valley, even if they've been temporarily misdirected. Reed glanced around the small camp. I know a place about 20 miles north, an abandoned mining operation in a box canyon, defensible with multiple escape routes. And then, Dakota pressed, then we gather evidence of Blackwood's crimes enough to bring to the territorial governor, or federal authorities. Reed's expression hardened. What he's done goes beyond unethical medicine. It's murder, kidnapping, violation of treaty rights. With the right evidence, he could be stopped permanently. Silas and Dakota exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Despite their caution, Reed's plan aligned with their own thinking, and Nolly's apparent trust in him carried significant weight. "We'll consider your proposal," Silas said finally. "Tonight you'll remain under watch. If your story holds until morning, we'll discuss next steps." Reed nodded, accepting the terms without protest. "Fair enough. I expected nothing less." As they settled into an uneasy truce for the night, Silas found himself studying their unexpected visitor. There was something compelling about Reed's quiet intensity, his evident determination to right wrongs he had perhaps initially enabled. It reminded Silas of his own journey from soldier, following orders, to medic, questioning the very nature of the conflict he served. Later, as Reed slept under Dakota's watchful eye, Silas sat with Nolly near the small fire. The girl seemed unusually animated, her hands occasionally moving in those graceful gestures that constituted her primary form of communication. "She's trying to tell you something," Dakota observed, keeping her voice low. "What?" "That the boundary is thinning." Dakota's expression was troubled. "Between our world and the spirit world. She feels it like a change in air pressure before a storm. Because of Blackwood's experiments. Perhaps, or perhaps something else entirely." Dakota glanced at the sleeping form of Reed. His arrival may not be coincidence. In the old stories, when the boundary between worlds grows thin, messengers appear to guide those who must take action. Silas wanted to dismiss such notions as superstition, but after what he'd witnessed in recent days, he found himself less certain of his rationalist convictions. "You think Reed is some kind of spiritual messenger? I think none of this is happening by chance, you finding Nolly, our escape through the ancient site, Reed finding us." Dakota's gaze was steady. "We are being drawn into something larger than ourselves, Silas Harlow. A battle not just for Nolly's safety, but for the proper order of things. The proper order being that the dead stay dead." There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine inquiry. "That the boundary between worlds remains intact," Dakota corrected gently. "There are things meant to pass through messages, memories, perhaps even souls when their time comes. But not physical beings, not mortal flesh. That is the natural law Blackwood seeks to violate." Silas considered her words, finding in them an echo of his own medical training. The body's systems maintain delicate balances that, when disrupted, led to disease and death. Perhaps the boundary between life and death was simply another such balance, one that extended beyond individual bodies to encompass all existence. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then stopping Blackwood isn't just about protecting Nolly. It's about protecting everything." "Yes." Dakota's voice was soft but certain. "That is what we face. That is why we cannot fail." The weight of her words settled over them like a physical presence. Outside their small circle of firelight, the vast wilderness stretched in all directions, filled with unseen forces and ancient mysteries. Somewhere within that darkness, Blackwood and his men continued their pursuit, driven by a desperate fear of the very natural order they threatened to disrupt. And here, in this hidden valley, 3 adults and 1 silent child represented the unlikely defense against that disruption. It seemed impossible, absurd even. Yet as Silas gazed at Nolly's solemn face illuminated by firelight, he felt a certainty that transcended rational thought. Some battles chose their warriors, not the other way around. This, it seemed, was one such battle. "We should rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As he settled into his bedroll for a few hours' sleep before his watch, Silas found himself listening to the night sounds of the valley with new awareness. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a nightbird, the soft breathing of his companions, all part of the natural order, the proper balance of things. And somewhere within that tapestry of sound, perhaps the voices of those who had passed beyond, watching and waiting to see if the boundary between their world and his would hold against the desperate ambitions of one dying man. Dawn broke over the hidden valley in ribbons of pale gold and rose, illuminating a world transformed by overnight frost. Every pine needle, every blade of grass glittered as though dipped in diamond dust. Under different circumstances, Silas might have paused to appreciate the beauty. Now he registered it only as improved visibility, a tactical advantage. Michael Reed had proven true to his word through the night, making no suspicious movements, offering information freely when asked. By unspoken agreement, Silas and Dakota had decided to accept his help, at least provisionally. "We should move soon," Reed said, accepting a cup of coffee from Dakota. "Blackwood's men will have regrouped by now, expanded their search pattern." "How many men does he have?" Silas asked, checking his rifle for the day's journey. "4 trackers, former cavalry scouts, 2 personal guards, and Flynn." Reed's expression darkened at the last name. Flynn, Jonas Flynn, ex-Army, specializes in retrieval, as Blackwood calls it. Reed's voice held controlled anger. "He's the one who actually captures the children for Blackwood's experiments. Takes pride in his work." Dakota, who had been helping Nolly prepare for travel, went still at Flynn's name. "He is the one who placed the marks on the children," she said quietly. "The brand." Reed nodded grimly. "He sees them as specimens, not people, especially native children." Silas felt a familiar cold anger settle in his chest, the same he'd felt during the war when witnessing cruelty masked as necessity. "This Flynn, he's dangerous, very. Expert tracker, better shot, no conscience to speak of." Reed set down his coffee. "If Blackwood's men have split up to search, Flynn will be leading one group. He'll be the one to find us eventually. Then we make sure that when he does, it's on our terms." Silas turned to Dakota. "How soon can you be ready?" "We are ready now." She gestured to their minimal belongings already packed and organized for quick departure. They moved out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, following Reed's lead toward the northern exit of the valley. The horses, rested after their day of relative ease, moved with fresh energy along the narrow game trail that wound up the cliff face. "This box canyon you mentioned," Silas said, as they rode. "How far?" "About 15 miles as the crow flies. Longer by trail." Reed pointed northwest. "There's an old mining settlement there, abandoned after the initial silver vein played out. Defensible position, stone buildings, clear sightlines." "And you're certain Blackwood doesn't know of it?" "As certain as I can be. It was never officially recorded. The miners wanted to avoid taxation." A hint of dry humor touched Reed's voice. "Their paranoia might save our lives." They traveled steadily through the morning, keeping to high ground where possible, using the dense pine forest for cover. Nolly rode with Dakota, occasionally pointing out directions that seemed to make no sense until they revealed hidden trails or easier passages. Whether this was native knowledge, spiritual guidance, or simply a child's keen observation skills, Silas couldn't say. He found himself less concerned with the source of her insights than their effectiveness. By midday, they had covered significant ground, the terrain gradually changing from steep mountain slopes to a series of descending plateaus. Reed called a brief halt in a sheltered hollow, allowing the horses to rest while they ate a cold meal. "There's something you should know," Reed said as they prepared to continue, "about Blackwood's condition." Silas looked up from adjusting his saddle. "His consumption, you mean?" "It's advanced further than Dakota might have realized when she left." Reed's expression was grim. "He's dying more quickly than expected. Weeks now, not months. And it's affecting his mind." "How so?" Dakota asked. "Paranoia, hallucinations, violent mood swings." Reed shook his head. "He was always obsessive, but now there's a desperation that makes him truly dangerous. He believes Nolly is his last chance." "Last chance for what exactly?" Silas pressed. "Dakota mentioned opening a doorway between worlds, but what does that actually mean?" Reed hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Blackwood believes that death is merely a barrier between dimensions, one that can be breached with the right combination of spiritual ability and scientific method. He's convinced that people like Nolly, those who can perceive beyond this barrier, hold the key to physically crossing it." "To what end? Immortality?" "Initially, yes, but his goal has evolved." Reed glanced at Nolly, who was listening intently despite her silence. "Now he speaks of bringing others back, specifically his wife Charlotte." "Resurrection." Dakota's voice was flat with disapproval. "A violation of natural law." "Exactly," Reed nodded. "In his more lucid moments, he frames it as scientific breakthrough, the next frontier of human understanding. In his darker ones, he speaks of armies of the returned, of ruling over both realms." Silas exchanged a glance with Dakota, seeing his own concern mirrored in her eyes. Madness driven by terminal illness was unpredictable, but madness with resources and loyal followers was genuinely dangerous. How would he even attempt such a thing? Silas asked. Reed's expression darkened further. His latest approach involves harvesting certain parts of the brain from those with spiritual abilities, specifically the pineal gland, which he believes acts as a receiver for communications from beyond. Harvesting. Dakota spoke the word like a curse. You mean cutting open their skulls while they live? Yes. Reed didn't shy from the brutal truth. He's done it 7 times now. Each child died, of course, and each failure drove him to more extreme methods. A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant cry of a hawk. We need to move, Silas said finally, his voice hard with renewed purpose. The sooner we reach this canyon, the sooner we can prepare for what's coming. They rode harder through the afternoon, pushing themselves and their mounts with the urgency of Reed's revelation driving them. The terrain grew increasingly rugged with narrow passes and steep descents that required careful navigation. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered on the western horizon, promising rough weather by nightfall. There, Reed said, eventually pointing to a narrow cleft in a towering wall of reddish stone ahead, the entrance to the canyon. Another hour, maybe less. As they approached the entrance, Nolly suddenly stiffened in Dakota's arms. She tugged urgently at Dakota's sleeve, making a series of quick gestures. What is it? Silas asked, noting the alarm in the girl's expression. Dakota frowned, interpreting. She says we're being watched, not just by the living. Reed looked confused. What does that mean? It means this place has history, Dakota replied. Death has walked here before. The mining settlement, Silas suggested. There must have been accidents, violence. More than that, I think. Dakota studied the canyon entrance with new wariness. Nolly senses many spirits, not just a few. Despite the ominous warning, they had little choice but to proceed. The storm was advancing quickly now, the light fading as clouds swallowed the late afternoon sun. They needed shelter before the deluge began. The canyon proved to be a natural fortress, narrow at its mouth, then widening into a roughly circular valley, perhaps half a mile across. Stone cliffs rose on all sides, their layered faces revealing the geological history of the region in bands of red gold and umber. At the far end, built against the cliff wall, stood the abandoned mining settlement, a cluster of stone buildings surrounding what appeared to be the entrance to a mine shaft. Perfect defensive position, Silas commented as they rode toward the structures. Only one way in or out. Not quite, Reed corrected. There's a secondary exit, a tunnel the miners dug through the northern cliff. It comes out about 2 miles away in a wooded ravine. Insurance against cave-ins blocking the main entrance. They reached the settlement as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The buildings, though weathered by time and elements, remained largely intact, a testament to the sturdy construction of their anonymous builders. The largest structure, presumably once the mining office, would serve as their main shelter. As they dismounted and began unloading their gear, Silas noticed Nolly's evident discomfort. The girl kept close to Dakota, her dark eyes constantly scanning the surrounding cliffs and buildings as though tracking invisible movements. She doesn't like this place, he observed quietly to Dakota. No, too much death lingers here. Dakota placed a protective hand on Nolly's shoulder. But we have little choice now. The storm comes. As if summoned by her words, the skies opened. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the canyon floor to mud within minutes. They hurried to complete their unloading, then led the horses to a lean-to structure that had once served as a stable. Inside the main building, Reed worked to start a fire in the stone hearth, while Silas checked the structural integrity of their shelter. Despite years of abandonment, the roof remained sound with only minor leaks that could be easily managed. The interior consisted of a large central room with a stone fireplace and 3 smaller chambers branching off adequate space for their small group. We should be safe here at least through the night, Silas said, returning to the main room where Dakota was laying out their damp bedrolls near the newly kindled fire. In the morning, we can better assess our defensive options. Reed nodded agreement. The rain works in our favor. It will wash away any tracks we left slow Blackwoods men if they're in the area. Unless they were already following us, Dakota pointed out, in which case they may know exactly where we are. The possibility hung in the air, unavoidable but unproductive to dwell upon. They had made their best choice under the circumstances. Now they could only prepare for whatever came. As night fell and the storm raged outside, They shared a meager meal and discussed plans for the coming days. Reed provided detailed information about Blackwood's methods, his men's tactics, and potential weaknesses they might exploit. Silas contributed his military experience, suggesting defensive arrangements and escape protocols. Dakota offered insights about the terrain and alternative routes should they need to flee again. Throughout their discussion, Nolly remained unusually agitated. She paced the room, occasionally stopping to stare at empty corners or doorways, as though seeing things invisible to the others. Finally, she approached Silas and tugged at his sleeve, her expression urgent. "What is it?" he asked gently. Instead of making her usual gestures to Dakota for translation, Nolly surprised them all by grabbing a stick from the kindling pile and beginning to draw on the earthen floor. With quick, precise movements, she sketched a rough map of the canyon, then added several X marks at specific locations. "She's showing us something," Reed observed, kneeling for a better view. Nolly continued drawing, adding stick figures at each X location, then lines connecting them to the mining settlement. Finally, she drew a larger figure approaching from the canyon entrance, surrounded by smaller figures. "Blackwood," Dakota translated. "And his men. She's showing us they're coming." "When?" Silas asked, directing the question to Nolly. The girl pointed to the rough map, then upward, then made a sleeping gesture. "Tomorrow night," Dakota interpreted. "She sees them arriving after dark tomorrow." Reed looked skeptical. "How could she possibly know that?" "The spirits tell her," Dakota said simply. "Those who watch from the other side see what we cannot." While Reed could question further, Nolly continued her drawing, adding details to the X locations she had marked. One appeared to be a ridgeline overlooking the canyon entrance. Another was positioned near what must be the secondary exit Reed had mentioned. The third was within the settlement itself beside what looked like the mine entrance. "Defensive positions," Silas realized. "She's showing us where to place ourselves for maximum advantage." "Not just that," Dakota said, watching as Nolly added more details. "She's showing us where the spirits of this place are strongest, where the boundary between worlds is thinnest, places of power." Reed ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with the concept. "And this helps us how exactly persistent? It means Blackwood will be drawn to these places," Dakota explained patiently, "especially the mine entrance. If his goal is to breach the barrier between life and death, he will sense where that barrier is already weakened. So we use that knowledge to set a trap." Silas concluded the tactical implications immediately clear. "Draw him to where we want him rather than defending everywhere at once." Nolly nodded, emphatically pleased that they understood. "It could work," Reed admitted. "Blackwood is sensitive to such things now. His illness has heightened his awareness of death's proximity. He might well be drawn to these locations Nolly has identified." They spent the next hour refining their strategy based on Nolly's insights, integrating them with more conventional defensive tactics. By the time they finally settled down to sleep, they had a plan that, while unorthodox, offered their best chance of countering Blackwood's numerical advantage. Silas took the first watch, positioning himself near the door, where he could monitor both the building and the canyon beyond. The storm continued, unabated lightning occasionally illuminating the landscape in stark, momentary clarity. During one such flash, Silas thought he saw a figure standing in the center of the settlement, a woman in outdated clothing, her form translucent against the driving rain. When the next lightning strike came, she was gone. "Getting as bad as Nolly," he muttered to himself, blaming fatigue and the surreal nature of recent events for the hallucination. Yet as the night deepened and the others slept, Silas found himself increasingly aware of subtle disturbances in the air around him. Temperature fluctuations, soft sounds just at the edge of hearing, fleeting movements in his peripheral vision. The rational part of his mind attributed these to the storm, to drafts in the old building, to normal settling noises of an abandoned structure. But another part, a part that had grown stronger since meeting Nolly and Dakota, wondered if the boundary Dakota spoke of truly was thinner here. If the dead of this place were drawing closer, attracted by Nolly's presence, or simply by the impending confrontation. "Elizabeth," he whispered into the darkness, half expecting, half fearing a response. None came, at least not one he could perceive. Yet he couldn't shake the sense that he was not alone in his vigil, that eyes beyond the veil of life watched with him, waiting for what was to come. Morning arrived with tentative sunlight breaking through dissipating clouds. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the canyon floor muddy, but the air crystal clear. As they emerged from their shelter to assess their surroundings in daylight, the abandoned mining settlement revealed itself more fully, a ghost town preserved by isolation and dry mountain air. 7 buildings total, Silas noted, mentally cataloging their defensive options. The main office where we slept, what looks like a dormitory, a stable and a say office, and 3 smaller structures, storage perhaps, or private quarters. And the mine entrance, Reed added, pointing to a dark opening in the cliff face behind the buildings, partially collapsed but still accessible. That's where the secondary tunnel begins. They spent the morning preparing for the confrontation Nolly had foreseen. Silas and Reed scouted the defensive positions the girl had indicated, finding them tactically sound, each offering excellent visibility and multiple retreat options. Dakota and Nolly searched the buildings for anything useful, discovering abandoned tools that could serve as weapons and old blankets that, while musty, would provide additional warmth. By midday, they had transformed the ghost town into a defensible position. Tripwires fashioned from old mining cable crossed potential approach routes. Piles of loose stone positioned on ledges above the canyon entrance could be dislodged to create rock slides. The horses were saddled and ready near the secondary tunnel, prepared for quick escape if necessary. As they gathered for a brief meal, the atmosphere was one of focused tension. According to Nolly's vision, they had hours yet before Blackwood's arrival, but the weight of impending confrontation pressed upon them all. "We should discuss what happens if things go wrong," Silas said, breaking the silence. "If we're separated or if one of us is captured." Dakota nodded, her expression grave. "Nolly's safety must come first. No matter what happens to any of us, she must not fall into Blackwood's hands." "Agreed," Reed said. "If it comes to it, I'll create a diversion to allow you to escape with her through the secondary tunnel." "We all might need to serve that role," Silas pointed out, "depending on how events unfold." And they continued discussing contingencies, speaking in the matter-of-fact tones of those who had faced danger before and harbored no illusions about the fragility of plans in the heat of conflict. Throughout their conversation, Nolly listened attentively, occasionally making suggestions, through Dakota, that revealed surprising tactical insight for one so young. As afternoon waned toward evening, they moved to their designated positions. Reed took the ridgeline overlooking the canyon entrance, armed with Silas's rifle and a signal mirror to alert the others when Blackwood's party appeared. Dakota and Nolly positioned themselves near the secondary tunnel entrance, inside the mine, ready to escape if necessary. Silas remained in the main settlement, serving as both bait and central coordinator of their defense. The sun sank behind the western cliffs, throwing the canyon into premature twilight. In the deepening shadows, the abandoned buildings took on an eerie quality, tombstones marking the dreams of men long gone. Silas, concealed within the main office building, found himself thinking of other ghost towns he'd seen during the war, communities abandoned in the face of advancing armies, lives interrupted and never resumed. A flash of light from the ridgeline pulled him from his reverie. Reed's signal. Blackwood had arrived. Silas moved to the window, keeping to the shadows as he peered toward the canyon entrance. At first he saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye, riders emerging from the narrow passage into the wider canyon, moving cautiously in the failing light. He counted 7 figures. Blackwood himself would be the central rider, the others positioned to protect him. They advanced slowly, clearly wary of ambush. One rider moved ahead of the others, scanning the ground for signs of recent passage. Flynn, most likely, based on Reed's description of the skilled tracker. The group halted about 200 yards from the settlement. After a brief discussion, they separated 4 riders, including Blackwood, continued toward the buildings, while 3 others dismounted and began moving along the canyon walls, seeking higher positions. The strategy was sound: establish a crossfire, secure the high ground approach with caution. These were not amateur pursuers, but experienced men who understood tactical advantage. Silas slipped away from the window and moved through the building's rear exit, staying low and using the structures for cover as he made his way toward the mine entrance. The plan relied on drawing Blackwood to the mine shaft, where the thinned boundary Nolly had identified might be used to their advantage. He reached the mine entrance just as dusk surrendered to full darkness. Inside, dimly illuminated by a small shielded lantern, Dakota and Nolly waited. "They've arrived," Silas reported quietly. 7 men as expected. They've split their forces, 4 approaching the settlement, 3 taking positions on the canyon walls. Dakota nodded, her face solemn in the lantern light. "Nolly says the spirits are gathering. They sense what Blackwood intends. Can they help us?" The question felt strange on Silas's tongue, a rational man asking for supernatural assistance. Yet after all he'd witnessed, it seemed a perfectly reasonable inquiry. Not directly. They cannot affect the physical world as we know it. Dakota glanced at Nolly, who was watching the darkness beyond the lantern's glow with intense concentration. But they can create disturbances, confusion in the minds of the living, especially those sensitive to their presence. Like Blackwood. Yes, his illness, his obsession, they have opened him to influences from beyond. Dakota's expression hardened. A weakness we must exploit. A soft sound from the mine entrance alerted them to Reed's arrival. He slipped into the lantern light, breathing hard from his quick descent from the ridgeline. "They're searching the buildings," he reported. "Blackwood remains on horseback in the center of the settlement. Flynn and 2 others are doing the actual searching." "And the 3 on the canyon walls?" Silas asked. "In position watching the settlement. They don't appear to have noticed the mine entrance yet." Reed wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "We don't have much time. Once they finish with the buildings, this is the logical next place to search." Silas nodded, mind racing through their options. "We proceed as planned. I'll create a distraction to draw Blackwood's attention specifically to the mine. You 2 get Nolly to the secondary tunnel and out. And leave you to face them alone." Dakota's tone made her opinion of this variation clear. "I'll follow once you're safely away," Silas assured her. "But someone needs to ensure they focus on the mine entrance rather than tracking you through the secondary tunnel." Before Dakota could protest further, a commotion erupted from the direction of the settlement. Shouts, then a single gunshot. "They've found something," Reed said, tensing. Moments later, a voice called out unnaturally loud in the canyon's acoustics. "We know you're here. Bring the girl out, and the rest of you can walk away." Silas recognized the calculated lie of a man who had no intention of letting anyone walk away. "That's my cue," he said, checking his revolver. "Get ready to move when you hear the signal." "Silas," Dakota caught his arm as he turned to go. "Be careful. These men have no honor." He met her gaze in the dim light, finding concern there that went beyond mere alliance of convenience. "I know. I'll be right behind you." As he turned to leave, Nolly suddenly stepped forward and grasped his hand. Her small fingers pressed something into his palm, a smooth stone with a spiral pattern etched into its surface. "For protection," Dakota translated. "A gift from the spirits." Silas closed his fingers around the token, oddly moved by the gesture. "Thank you." He slipped out of the mine entrance and into the darkness, circling wide to approach the settlement from the opposite direction. The moon 3/4 full provided just enough light to navigate by once his eyes adjusted to the night. From his new position, he could see Blackwood and his men clearly. The doctor remained mounted in the center of the settlement, a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a heavy coat despite the mild evening. Even at a distance, there was something unsettling about his stillness, an unnatural patience that suggested confidence rather than uncertainty. Flynn and the other searchers had emerged from the buildings and were reporting their findings. Though Silas couldn't hear their words, their body language indicated frustration. The settlement appeared empty to them. Time for that to change. Silas positioned himself behind the assay office, took careful aim at an old metal ore cart and fired. The sound echoed through the canyon like thunder. The bullet striking the cart with a resounding clang that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the settlement. Instantly, Blackwood's men dropped into defensive postures, rifles raised toward the source of the shot. Only Blackwood himself remained unmoved, his attention now fixed in Silas's direction, with laser-like intensity. "That's right," Silas muttered. "Focus on Masait." He fired again, this time aiming at the ground near Blackwood's horse. The animal shied nervously, but didn't bolt, evidently well-trained for combat situations. Blackwood calmed it with a practiced hand, then spoke to Flynn, who immediately began directing the others toward Silas's position. "Time to move." Silas retreated quickly, firing once more to maintain their attention, then circled back toward the mine entrance. The route took him perilously close to the settlement, but the darkness and scattered buildings provided adequate cover. As he approached the mine, he caught sight of Flynn leading 3 men in his direction, while Blackwood and the remaining 2 riders maintained their position in the settlement center. The division of forces was predictable but effective. Flynn would flush out the shooter, while Blackwood held the strategic center. Silas reached the mine entrance just ahead of his pursuers. Inside, he found the lantern extinguished and no sign of Dakota, Nolly, or Reed. Good they had followed the plan, making their way to the secondary tunnel while he created the distraction. Now for the next phase. Silas positioned himself just inside the mine entrance, concealed behind a support beam, but visible enough to be spotted by careful searchers. When Flynn's silhouette appeared against the night sky, Silas deliberately scraped his boot against stone, creating a sound too deliberate to be accidental. "In here," Flynn called to his companions, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. "Spread out. No unnecessary shooting. Blackwood wants the girl alive." Silas waited until the first man entered the mine, then fired a shot into the ceiling. Stone fragments showered down and the man stumbled back with a curse. Silas used the moment to retreat deeper into the shaft, following the route Dakota had described to the junction, where the main tunnel met the secondary escape passage. Behind him, he heard Flynn ordering a more cautious advance. They would proceed slowly now, wary of additional traps or ambushes. That caution would buy precious minutes for the others to escape through the secondary tunnel. Silas reached the junction and paused, listening. No sounds of pursuit yet, but they wouldn't be far behind. He turned toward the secondary tunnel, then froze as a familiar voice echoed through the mine shaft. "I know what you're doing, Mr. Harlow." Blackwood's voice cultured and calm despite the resonant cough that punctuated his words. "Leading us away from the girl. A noble effort, but ultimately futile." Silas remained silent, calculating. Blackwood shouldn't have known his name. Unless... "Yes, I've had men watching your cabin for some time," Blackwood continued, as though reading his thoughts. "Ever since reports of a scarred Indian woman and a silent child reached Fort Ellis. I knew Dakota would seek help, and a reclusive army medic seemed a likely candidate." The revelation sent a chill through Silas. If Blackwood had been watching his cabin, he might have tracked them from the beginning, might even now have men positioned at the secondary tunnel's exit. "What I find most interesting," Blackwood went on, his voice growing closer, "is your involvement, Dr. Reed. I had such hopes for you, a mind open to the possibilities beyond conventional science. Yet here you are, allying yourself with savages and hermits against the greatest discovery in human history." Reed had been compromised. Whether captured or simply spotted, Blackwood now knew of his presence. The plan was unraveling. Silas weighed his options. Continue to the secondary tunnel and risk walking into an ambush, or return to the main shaft and face Blackwood directly, perhaps creating a new opportunity for the others to escape. The decision was made for him when a flicker of movement caught his eye, a figure approaching from the direction of the secondary tunnel. For a moment, he thought it might be Dakota returning, but as the shape resolved in the dim light, he recognized Flynn's distinctive silhouette. "End of the line, soldier," Flynn said quietly, raising a revolver. "Drop your weapon." Silas assessed his chances. Flynn had the drop on him, and from the sounds behind, Blackwood and his men were closing in from the main shaft. He was trapped. Slowly, he placed his revolver on the ground. "Wise choice," Flynn commented. "The doctor wants words with you before the end." Flynn prodded him back toward the main shaft, where lantern light now illuminated the rough-hewn walls. Blackwood stood waiting, supported by a cane, his tall frame emaciated by illness. Despite his obvious physical deterioration, his eyes burned with unsettling intensity in his gaunt face. "Mr. Harlow," Blackwood greeted him with incongruous politeness. "Thank you for your cooperation." "Where are the others?" "Gone," Silas replied. "Well beyond your reach by now." Blackwood smiled thinly. "I think not. My men are positioned at both exits from this canyon. If they had escaped, I would have been informed." He studied Silas with clinical detachment. "No, I suspect they're still within these tunnels, perhaps hoping to wait until we leave." The doctor turned to Flynn. "Search every branch and crevice. Find the girl. Kill the others if necessary, but I want her unharmed." Flynn nodded and gestured to two of his men, who disappeared down adjacent passages with lanterns raised. Blackwood returned his attention to Silas. "While we wait, perhaps you'd satisfy my curiosity," he said conversationally. "What did Dakota tell you about my work? What lies did she use to turn you against scientific progress?" "She told me you murder children for your research," Silas replied bluntly. "That seems less like progress and more like monstrosity." Blackwood sighed as though disappointed by a student's simplistic answer. "Sacrifices are necessary in all great endeavors. You were a soldier, surely you understand that concept." "I understand the difference between casualties of war and deliberate murder of innocents." Innocence, Blackwood's tone sharpened. These are not ordinary children, Mr. Harlow. They are aberrations, evolutionary anomalies whose abilities defy natural law. Studying them, then understanding the source of their powers is the key to humanity's next great leap forward. You mean your personal leap beyond death, Silas countered. This isn't about humanity. It's about your fear of dying. A spasm of anger crossed Blackwood's face before he controlled it. My personal motivations are irrelevant. The knowledge gained will benefit all mankind. Knowledge gained through torture and murder benefits no one. Before Blackwood could respond, a commotion erupted from one of the side passage's shouts, then a single gunshot. Flynn returned moments later dragging Reed, whose face was bloodied and whose left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Found this one trying to collapse a section of tunnel, Flynn reported, shoving Reed to his knees beside Silas. No sign of the woman or girl yet. Blackwood regarded Reed with genuine regret. Michael, I expected better from you. I expected better from science, Reed replied, his voice strained but defiant. What you're doing isn't research. It's desperation masked as progress. You always did lack vision. Blackwood turned away dismissively. Keep searching, Flynn. They must be here somewhere. As Flynn moved to continue the search, a strange sound echoed through the mine shaft, a child's voice singing in a language Silas didn't recognize. The simple melody sent chills down his spine, not from fear, but from an inexplicable sense of presence, as though the very air had suddenly grown thick with invisible watchers. Blackwood went rigid, his face transforming with an almost religious fervor. The girl, he breathed, she's opened the way. Before anyone could react, he was moving deeper into the mine with surprising speed for one so ill, following the sound of the singing. Flynn hesitated, clearly torn between guarding the prisoners and following his employer. Go, ordered one of the remaining men. We've got these two. Flynn nodded and hurried after Blackwood, leaving Silas and Reed under guard of two armed men. The singing continued, ethereal and haunting, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What is that? Silas whispered to Reed. A crow death song, Reed replied softly, sung during the transition between worlds. One of the guards shifted nervously. Shut up, both of you. Silas felt something cold against his hand the stone nollie had given him. He'd been clutching it unconsciously since his capture. Now, as the singing intensified, he felt it grow colder still, almost painful to hold. The lantern flames suddenly danced and wavered, though there was no draft in the still air of the mine. Shadows along the walls seemed to move independently of their sources, stretching and contracting in impossible ways. What the hell? One guard muttered, raising his lantern higher, as though better light would dispel the uncanny distortions. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. Then from deeper in the mine, where Blackwood and Flynn had disappeared, came a scream not of pain or fear, but of ecstatic revelation. He's found her, Reed said grimly. God help us all. The guards exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsettled by the scream and the continuing shadow play around them. Silas felt the stone in his hand pulse once like a heartbeat and instinctively closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the mine shaft had changed. The physical structure remained the same, but overlaid upon it was another reality. Translucent figures moved through and around the solid forms of the living, their features indistinct, but their presence undeniable. The boundary between worlds that Dakota had spoken of was not merely thinning, it was dissolving before his eyes. Silas glanced at Reed and saw from his expression that he was witnessing the same phenomenon. The guards, however, seemed oblivious, though increasingly agitated by some sense of wrongness they couldn't identify. Now, Silas whispered to Reed and lunged for the nearest guard. The man was so unnerved by the supernatural disturbances that his reaction came too late. Silas tackled him to the ground, the impact sending the guard's revolver skittering across stone. Reed, despite his injured arm, launched himself at the second guard, using his body weight to knock the man off balance. A chaotic struggle ensued, complicated by the disorienting visual effects of the thin boundary. Spectral figures passed through the combatants, momentarily distracting both prisoners and guards. Silas managed to subdue his opponent with a well-placed strike to the temple, rendering him unconscious. Reed was faring worse due to his injury, locked in a desperate grapple with the second guard, who was reaching for a knife at his belt. Silas scrambled to help, grabbing the fallen revolver and bringing its butt down hard on the back of the guard's head. The man collapsed, releasing Reed, who fell back against the tunnel wall, breathing heavily. Thanks, Reed gasped, cradling his broken arm. Though I think our ghost friends were helping too. Silas nodded, having noticed how the guard had repeatedly flinched and misdirected his blows, as though constantly distracted by movements only peripherally perceived. We need to find Dakota and Nolly before Blackwood does whatever he's planning. They moved deeper into the mine, following the direction Blackwood and Flynn had taken. The supernatural manifestations grew stronger. As they progressed, the air colder, the spectral figures more distinct, the boundary between physical and spiritual realms increasingly permeable. They emerged into a large chamber that must have been the heart of the original mining operation. Here, the veil between worlds seemed thinnest of all. Silas could see both the physical chamber, with its abandoned equipment and rotting support beams, and superimposed upon it a gathering of translucent forms arranged in concentric circles around a central point. At that point stood Nolly, her small figure somehow more substantial than her surroundings, as though she were the only truly real thing in a world of shadows. Before her, Blackwood knelt in supplication, his face transported with religious ecstasy. Flynn stood nearby, his expression a mixture of awe and terror, as he witnessed something his rational mind couldn't accept. Dakota was there too, held at gunpoint by Flynn, her face stoic but her eyes reflecting deep concern as she watched Nolly. The girl's hands moved in complex patterns, not the sign language she used with Dakota, but something older, more primal gestures that seemed to physically manipulate the barrier between worlds. With each movement, the spectral figures grew more distinct, the physical world more tenuous. "What's happening?" Silas whispered. "Blackwood's forced her to open the way," Reed replied, his voice hushed with dread. "He's getting what he wanted, a doorway between life and death. Can we stop it?" "I don't know. This is beyond my understanding." Before they could decide on a course of action, Blackwood rose to his feet, turning toward Flynn with newfound strength in his emaciated frame. "It's working," he announced, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "The barrier thins. Soon we can cross." He gestured to Nolly. "The child is the key. Her abilities create the bridge. Once I understand how, I can replicate the process at will." "Doctor," Flynn said uneasily, "this doesn't feel right. Maybe we should—" "Silence!" Blackwood's command cracked like a whip. "We stand at the threshold of the greatest discovery in human history. Nothing will stop us now." He turned back to Nolly, who continued her intricate gestures, her expression remote and focused. "Show me the way, child. Show me how to cross." In response, Nolly's movements changed, becoming more fluid, more insistent. The spectral figures began to move, forming a path leading away from the chamber into darkness beyond. At the head of this path stood a figure more distinct than the others, a woman in clothing from another era, her face serene but determined. Blackwood saw her too, his breath catching. "Charlotte," he whispered, "you've come." The apparition made no response but extended her hand in what might have been invitation or warning. Without hesitation, Blackwood stepped forward, reaching for the outstretched hand. As his fingers neared the spectral form, a change came over both, the woman growing more substantial, Blackwood more translucent, as though they were meeting halfway between their respective realms. "No," Reed shouted, breaking the trance-like atmosphere. "Blackwood, stop! You don't understand what's happening." Blackwood turned his form now, ghostly, partially merged with the spiritual plane. "I understand perfectly. Michael, I am transcending the final barrier. Death has no power over those who know its secrets." Flynn, shaken from his paralysis by Reed's shout, raised his weapon. "This has gone too far, Doctor. I didn't sign on for whatever this is." "Lower your gun, Flynn," Blackwood commanded. "You're witnessing a miracle." Instead, Flynn aimed at Nolly. "Stop this, now!" Everything happened at once. Dakota lunged at Flynn despite the gun trained on her. Silas fired the revolver he'd taken from the guard, his shot going wide in his haste. Reed charged forward despite his injury, and Nolly completed a final decisive gesture that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality around them. A blinding light filled the chamber, accompanied by a sound like the rush of mighty waters. Silas felt himself falling, though, whether physically or through some metaphysical space he couldn't tell. Images flashed before him, faces he knew and didn't know, places he'd been and never seen, moments of time stretching backward and forward in impossible sequences. Then abruptly stillness, darkness, silence. Gradually his senses returned. He was lying on the cold stone floor of the chamber, the taste of copper in his mouth suggesting he'd bitten his tongue during whatever had just occurred. Around him, others were stirring. Reed groaning as he regained consciousness. Dakota already on her feet and moving toward Nolly, who stood in the center of the chamber, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Of Blackwood and Flynn, there was no sign. What happened? Silas managed pushing himself to a sitting position. Where are they? Dakota gathered Nolly into her arms before responding. Blackwood crossed over. Flynn, she hesitated. Flynn was caught between. Neither fully here nor fully there. You mean they're dead? Reed asked, his scientific mind struggling to frame the experience in familiar terms. Blackwood is beyond death now, in the place he sought so desperately to reach. Dakota's expression was solemn. Whether that place is what he imagined, that is another question. Silas looked around the chamber, noting that the supernatural manifestations had receded. The air felt normal again, the spectral figures gone, the boundary between worlds apparently restored to its proper state. Did Nolly do this, he asked. Did she send them to the other side? No, Dakota replied. Blackwood crossed of his own will, drawn by what he thought was his wife's spirit. What he found on the other side? She shook her head. The spirits do not take kindly to those who violate natural law. Flynn was simply too close when the barrier reasserted itself. They made their way out of the mine in silence, each processing the extraordinary events in their own way. Outside, dawn was breaking over the canyon rim, painting the abandoned settlement in soft gold light. The horses of Blackwood's men had scattered, but their own mounts remained tethered where they had left them. What now? Reed asked as they emerged into the new day. Blackwood's gone, but his men are still out there, and there's the matter of the evidence we came for proof of his crimes. The map, Dakota reminded them. The survey showing his plans to exploit Crow land. It's enough to bring before the territorial governor, especially with your testimony. Reed nodded. And the remaining men? Without Blackwood and Flynn, they'll likely disperse. Most were hired guns with no personal stake in his obsessions. We'll need to be cautious, nonetheless, Silas said. At least until we're well away from here. They gathered their belongings and prepared to depart, all eager to leave behind the canyon and its unsettling memories. As they mounted their horses, Silas found himself looking back at the mine entrance one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing there, not Blackwood or Flynn, but a woman in a nurse's uniform, her face both familiar and beloved. Elizabeth raised her hand in what seemed like farewell, her expression peaceful. Then she was gone, leaving only the dark opening in the cliff face. Silas, Dakota's voice pulled him back to the present. Are you ready? He turned to find her watching him with understanding in her dark eyes. Yes, he said, I'm ready. They traveled north away from the canyon and its ghosts, following game trails and abandoned mining roads that kept them hidden from potential pursuit. Though they encountered no sign of Blackwood's remaining men, caution guided their journey. They moved primarily at night, resting during daylight hours in concealed camps. Nolly slept most of the first day, exhausted by her spiritual exertions. When she finally woke, her eyes seemed clearer. Somehow her expression more childlike than before. She still didn't speak aloud, but her gestures appeared lighter, less burdened by the weight of voices only she could hear. The opening of the barrier drained her, Dakota explained when Silas remarked on the change. But it also helped her, like lancing a wound to release infection. She'll recover, in time, and perhaps with greater control of her abilities now that she's experienced their full extent. Reed's broken arm required proper attention. At their first secure camp, Silas and Dakota worked together to set the bone, combining his medical training with her knowledge of pain management through pressure points and herbal remedies. The collaboration was seamless, each respecting the other's expertise, building on their earlier exchange of healing practices. You two work well together, Reed observed through gritted teeth as they finished splinting his arm. Different methods, same results. The body doesn't care where healing comes from, Dakota replied. Only that it comes. On the fourth day of their journey, they reached a river marking the border of Blackfoot territory. Here, Reed announced his intention to separate from their group. I need to take the evidence to Helena, he explained, referring to the territorial capital. Find someone in authority who'll listen. The sooner Blackwood's operations are officially investigated, the safer you'll be. You're still recovering, Silas pointed out. That arm needs time to heal. I'll manage. Reed's expression was determined. This needs to be done, and you two need to get Nolly somewhere safe. I can travel faster alone anyway." They couldn't argue with his logic. After providing him with supplies and detailed directions to the nearest settlement, they parted ways with genuine regret. Despite the brevity of their acquaintance, shared danger had forged a bond of respect between them. "If you ever need help," Reed said in parting, "send word to Dr. Michael Reed Helena. I'll come." "Likewise," Silas replied, "though I hope we meet again under better circumstances." Dakota offered Reed a small pouch of herbs. "For pain," she explained, "and to prevent fever in the wound." With a final nod of thanks, Reed rode west toward Helena, while Silas, Dakota, and Nolly continued north into Blackfoot lands. 2 days later, they reached their destination, a secluded valley where, according to Dakota, a respected Blackfoot medicine man named Manyhawks resided. The elder had a reputation for understanding spiritual gifts like Nolly's, and had agreed to provide sanctuary when Dakota had sent word through tribal networks months earlier. The valley proved to be a natural haven, sheltered by mountains on 3 sides, watered by clear streams, populated by scattered family groups, who maintained traditional ways while adapting selectively to changing times. Manyhawks himself lived apart from the main encampment in a cabin that blended native construction with elements adopted from white settlers. He greeted them at the valley entrance, having been alerted to their approach by young scouts. Despite his advanced age, he stood straight and tall, his weathered face reflecting both wisdom and humor in equal measure. "Dakota of the Crow," he said in English for Silas's benefit, "you have traveled far with precious cargo." His gaze moved to Nolly, softening with recognition of her nature. "The spirit seer. Yes, I see it in her eyes. She has walked between worlds recently." "Too recently," Dakota confirmed. "She needs rest guidance." "She will have both here." Manyhawks turned his attention to Silas, studying him with penetrating intensity. "And you healer with soldiers' hands. You stand at your own crossroads." Silas felt uncomfortably exposed under the elder's scrutiny, as though his inner thoughts were being read. "I'm just helping them reach safety." Manyhawks smiled slightly. "Are you? Or are they helping you find what you've lost?" Without waiting for a response, he gestured toward the valley. "Come. You are welcome among us for as long as needed." The hospitality offered was simple but genuine. They were provided with a small cabin near Manyhawk's own, given fresh food and clean clothing, and left to rest after their arduous journey. For the first time since leaving Silas's mountain home, they could relax their vigilance, secure in the protection of the Blackfoot community. That evening, as they shared a meal with Manyhawks, the elder explained his plan for Nolly's education. "She has great power but little control. I will teach her to direct her sight to open and close the door to the spirit world at will rather than being constantly surrounded by its voices." "Can such a thing be taught?" Silas asked, genuinely curious. "Of course. All gifts can be refined through proper instruction." Manyhawks regarded Nolly with grandfatherly affection. "She will learn to live in both worlds without being consumed by either." As days passed, a routine established itself. Each morning, Nolly spent time with Manyhawks, learning the disciplines that would help her manage her abilities. Dakota assisted with these lessons while also serving as healer for the Blackfoot families, sharing her medical knowledge freely. Silas found himself similarly occupied treating injuries and illnesses among the valley's residents. Word of his skills spread quickly, and soon people were coming to him with ailments ranging from toothaches to more serious conditions requiring his surgical expertise. Working together, he and Dakota developed a unique approach to healing that combined the best aspects of both traditions. Her knowledge of herbal remedies complemented his surgical techniques. His understanding of anatomy enhanced her traditional treatments. Patients benefited from this integrated care, often recovering more quickly than either healer expected. In the evenings, they would gather with Manyhawks, sharing meals and stories. The elder was a natural teacher, his tales containing wisdom disguised as entertainment. Through these informal sessions, Silas gained greater understanding of native perspectives on life, death, and the spaces between concepts he had previously dismissed as superstition, but now recognized as alternative frameworks for interpreting the same universal experiences. 2 weeks into their stay, as autumn painted the valley in russet and gold, Silas realized he had made no plans to leave. The thought of returning to his solitary cabin on the mountain no longer held appeal. Something had shifted within him. The armor of isolation he'd constructed after Elizabeth's death had begun to crack, allowing new connections to form. He found Dakota by a stream near their cabin, washing bandages they had used earlier while treating a child's lacerated foot. The sunlight played across her features, softening the scar that marked her face. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. "I've been thinking," Silas said without preamble, "about what happens next." Dakota set aside her work, giving him her full attention. "And what have you decided?" "I am. That's just it, I haven't decided. For the first time in years, I don't have a clear path." He sat beside her on a sun-warmed rock. "After Elizabeth died, all I wanted was solitude. A place to nurse my grief without witnesses. Now you're not sure that's enough," she finished when he hesitated. "No, it's not." The admission felt both frightening and liberating. "What about you? Will you stay here with Nolly for a time, until she has mastered her abilities sufficiently to live without constant guidance?" Dakota's gaze moved to the distant mountains. "After that, I had not planned beyond keeping her safe." "We're quite a pair," Silas observed with a hint of humor. "Both so focused on the immediate that we've forgotten how to envision a future." Dakota smiled, a rare expression that transformed her serious face. "Perhaps that is not entirely bad. The present moment is where life actually happens." They fell into comfortable silence, watching the stream's clear water flowing over smooth stones. In the distance, children's laughter echoed from the main encampment, a sound of life continuing, of normal joys persisting despite the shadows that haunted the wider world. "Many hawks asked me if I would consider staying," Dakota said eventually. "There is need for a healer with my training, especially as more settlers move into the territory. Someone who understands both worlds." "He asked me something similar," Silas admitted. "Said there's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles up the valley that could be made habitable with some work." Their eyes met in a shared understanding of what remained unspoken, that they could both stay, continuing the partnership that had developed so naturally between them. Neither mentioned the growing personal connection that had evolved alongside their professional collaboration, but its presence hummed in the air between them. "What did you tell him?" Dakota asked. "That I needed time to consider." Silas picked up a stone and turned it in his fingers, feeling its smooth contours. "What about you?" "The same." She reclaimed a bandage from the water, wringing it out with practiced hands. "Nolly has grown attached to this place. And to you." "I've grown attached to her as well." The admission came easily. "To both of you." Dakota looked up, her dark eyes meeting his directly. "Is that why you would stay?" "Attachment." "Partly." Silas considered his next words carefully. "But also because I've found purpose here. Not just in healing bodies, but in healing myself, I suppose. Finding a way forward that isn't defined solely by what I've lost." "A worthy purpose." Dakota's voice was soft. "Loss shapes us, but need not define us forever." In that moment, with the afternoon sun warming their shoulders and the stream singing its eternal song, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider during their dangerous journey. "I think I will accept Many Hawk's offer," Silas said finally, "at least for now. See where this path leads." Dakota nodded, a simple acceptance that required no further elaboration. "I will do the same." That evening, as they shared their decisions with Many Hawks, the elder seemed unsurprised but pleased. "The spirit world has its own wisdom," he commented. "It brings together those who need each other sometimes through strange paths." Nolly, upon hearing they would all remain in the valley, smiled her rare luminous smile and made a series of gestures to Dakota. "What did she say?" Silas asked. "That she saw this coming." Dakota translated, amusement touching her voice. "Apparently the spirits told her we would find home here together." "Did they now?" Silas raised an eyebrow at Nolly, who responded with a solemn nod that barely concealed her satisfaction. "Well, far be it from me to argue with the spirit world." The following days took on new purpose as they began establishing more permanent roots in the valley. Silas, with help from several Blackfoot men, started renovating the old trapper's cabin, replacing rotted logs, repairing the roof, building proper furniture. The work was physically demanding, but satisfying, each improvement a tangible step toward a future he was gradually allowing himself to imagine. Dakota divided her time between assisting Many Hawks with Nolly's education and developing a more comprehensive healing practice that served both the Blackfoot community and occasional settlers from surrounding areas. Her reputation grew steadily, drawing people who might otherwise have avoided native healers. Through her example, barriers of prejudice began to erode, replaced by respect for results that spoke for themselves. Nolly flourished under Many Hawk's tutelage. Though she still preferred sign language to spoken words, she occasionally surprised them with verbal comments, her voice soft but clear. More significantly, she showed increasing ability to control when and how she interacted with the spirit world, no longer constantly bombarded by voices only she could hear, but able to open herself to them selectively when appropriate. One crisp evening in late autumn, as the first snowflakes began to dust the valley, Silas sat on the porch of his nearly completed cabin. The structure stood on a small rise with a view of both the Blackfoot encampment and the broader valley beyond, not isolated yet, offering the private space he still sometimes needed. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Dakota emerged from the gathering dusk wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. She carried something in her hands, a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "May I join you?" she asked, pausing at the foot of the porch steps. "Always." Silas shifted to make room on the bench he'd crafted from pine logs. Dakota sat beside him, her warmth a pleasant contrast to the cooling air. For a time, they simply watched the snow fall, content in shared silence. Then she handed him the bundle. "A gift," she said, "for your new home." Silas unwrapped the leather covering to reveal a finely crafted medicine bag, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns he recognized as having special significance in Crow tradition. Inside were small compartments containing various herbs, roots, and mineral elements, a complete healing kit, combining elements from both their traditions. "It's beautiful," he said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you." Many Hawk says a healer's tools should reflect the healer's spirit. Dakota's gaze was warm in the fading light. "Yours bridges two worlds, as does mine." It seemed fitting. "I have something for you as well," Silas admitted, though not as finely crafted. He reached inside the cabin, through the open door, and retrieved a small wooden box. "I've been working on it in the evenings." Dakota opened the box to find a set of surgical instruments, small, precise tools made from steel, but with handles carved from antler and wood in traditional native designs. Each had been carefully crafted to fit her smaller hands, with patterns that reflected elements of Crow symbolism. "You made these?" she asked, clearly surprised. "The metal parts I traded for from a blacksmith who passed through last week. The handles I carved myself." Silas felt uncharacteristically self-conscious. "I remembered how you mentioned standard instruments never quite fit your grip." Dakota ran her fingers over the tools, her expression soft with appreciation. "They're perfect. Truly, Silas. Thank you." The intimate use of his given name, still rare between them, despite all they had shared, warmed him more than any fire could have. In that moment, as snow continued to fall around them and the valley settled into evening peace, the last barriers between them seemed to dissolve. "Dakota," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about us, about what might be possible." She met his gaze steadily, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply present and attentive. "When Elizabeth died, I thought that part of my life was over," he continued, "that I'd never again feel—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Feel connected to another person that way. I built walls, retreated to the mountain, convinced myself that solitude was enough. And now," Dakota's voice was soft but direct, "now I know better." Silas turned to face her fully. "These past months, the danger, the journey, what we witnessed together, they've changed me. You've changed me, shown me that there are different kinds of healing, different paths to wholeness." A small smile touched Dakota's lips. "You have changed me as well. Reminded me that strength can be found in unexpected places, in unexpected people." Silas reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were strong, capable, slightly calloused from her work, a healer's hands like his own. "I don't know what this is between us," he admitted, "or what it might become. But I'd like to find out if you are willing." Dakota's fingers tightened around his. "I am willing, more than willing." Her dark eyes held both certainty and vulnerability. "We are neither of us who we were when we first met. Perhaps that is as it should be." As if to seal this new understanding, the snow began to fall more heavily, wrapping them in a curtain of white that separated their small world from everything beyond. They sat together as darkness claimed the valley. Their hands joined the future stretching before them, uncertain but faced together. 1 year later, spring sunshine warmed the valley as Silas completed his morning rounds. He had visited 3 Blackfoot families and 1 settler homestead, treating ailments ranging from a newborn's colic to an elderly man's rheumatism. The saddlebags on his horse contained medicines from both traditions. Herbal remedies Dakota had prepared, alongside conventional pharmaceuticals obtained from Helena on his occasional trips to the territorial capital. As he rode toward home, he reflected on the year's changes. The cabin on the rise had expanded to include a proper treatment room where he and Dakota saw patients together. A small garden of medicinal plants flourished beside it, tended by both of them with knowledge shared and enhanced through their partnership. Nolly, now 10, divided her time between studying with many hawks and assisting in their healing practice. Her gift had evolved from burden to blessing as she learned to control it now to communicate with the spirit world when needed, but also to close that door and simply be a child. She spoke more frequently aloud, though sign language remained her preferred method of expression with those she trusted most. News had reached them 3 months earlier of Dr. Vernon Blackwood's official death. According to Michael Reed, who maintained regular correspondence with them, the territorial authorities had declared the doctor deceased after a thorough investigation found no trace of him beyond the abandoned mining settlement. Reed himself had been instrumental in bringing to light Blackwood's unethical experiments and plans to violate Crow Treaty lands, resulting in formal apologies and renewed protection for the affected tribes. Flynn and the other men had similarly vanished, though rumors occasionally surfaced of a strange half-seen figure wandering the mountains near the canyon, neither fully corporeal nor entirely spirit, caught between worlds as Dakota had suggested. Whether truth or campfire tale, the stories served to keep curious settlers away from the ancient site within the mountain. As Silas approached their home, he saw Dakota in the garden harvesting early spring herbs with practiced efficiency. She looked up at the sound of his horse shading her eyes against the sun. The scar on her face had faded somewhat over the past year, no longer angry red, but a silvery line that did nothing to diminish her beauty in his eyes. "Successful rounds," she called as he dismounted. "All patients improving," he confirmed, leading his horse to the small stable they had built together. "Though Old Bear's cough still concerns me, I've prepared a stronger decoction for him. We can take it together this evening." The easy collaboration still amazed him sometimes, how naturally they had integrated their different approaches to healing, creating something stronger and more effective than either tradition alone. Their personal relationship had developed with similar organic harmony, moving from cautious friendship to deep partnership in gradual, unhurried steps. After tending to his horse, Silas joined Dakota in the garden. Without speaking, she handed him several of the plants she had gathered, which he recognized as ingredients for a pain-relieving salve they had developed together. "Nolly is with many hawks," he asked, sorting the herbs as they had taught each other. "Yes, he's teaching her a new focusing technique today." Dakota smiled slightly. She was quite excited. Apparently it involves communication with animal spirits specifically. "Useful knowledge for hunting season," Silas observed with the pragmatism that balanced Dakota's more spiritual perspective. They worked together in comfortable silence for a time, the simple task of preparing medicines as intimate in its way as any embrace. Their hands occasionally brushed each touch, a reminder of the bond that had grown between them, unexpected, but no less precious for its surprise. Later, as afternoon settled into evening, they sat together on the porch of their shared home, watching the valley come alive with the activities of spring. In the distance, Nolly was returning from Many Hawk's cabin, her step light, her face animated, as she spoke with 2 Blackfoot children who had become her friends. "She's happy," Silas observed. "Truly happy, not just surviving." "As are we all," Dakota replied, her hand finding his in the space between their chairs. "We have built something good here, Silas Harlow." "We have." He turned to look at her, still sometimes amazed by the journey that had brought them together. "Though I never imagined this would be my path. The best paths are often those we don't plan." Dakota's expression was serene in the golden light. "The spirits guided us here for a reason." Once he might have gently contested such a statement, offering more rational explanations for the sequence of events that had led to their current life. Now, having witnessed what he had, having experienced the thinning of boundaries between worlds, he found himself more open to possibilities beyond rational understanding. "Perhaps they did," he agreed. "Or perhaps it was simply that 3 wounded souls recognized in each other the possibility of healing." Is there a difference? Dakota asked with quiet wisdom. Silas considered this, watching as Nolly approached their home, her face brightening at the sight of them waiting for her. No, he said finally. I don't suppose there is. As dusk settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they welcomed Nolly home, the three of them bound by experiences that defied conventional explanation, but had forged connections stronger than blood. Together they had crossed boundaries, both physical and metaphysical, finding, in the process, not just safety or purpose, but family different from what any of them had lost, yet no less real for its unconventional origins. In the gathering darkness, Silas thought he glimpsed a familiar figure at the edge of their clearing, Elizabeth watching with what seemed like approval before fading into the twilight shadows. Whether true vision or merely imagination hardly mattered. The blessing felt real, a final release from the grief that had once defined him. Life continued. The boundary between worlds held firm, yet remained permeable in the ways that mattered most, allowing memory and love to pass through while maintaining the natural order of existence. And in the space between what was and what might be, three souls found healing in each other's presence, creating a home where none had existed before. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a boundary crossed, but a boundary honored, with the wisdom to know the difference.